Chapter 41. Exceptional Promotion. Oliver Wood's eyes lit up when he discovered that Harry Potter had never played Quidditch. With a flourish, he opened a crate and laid out the game's 3 balls. "Here we have the quaffle," he said, lifting a leather sphere, "the 2 bludgers." He tapped the iron balls with a grin. "And of course, the golden snitch." He was just about to launch into a full explanation of the rules when Sherlock Holmes raised a hand. "No need for a lecture," Sherlock said calmly. "Just get us 2 broomsticks." Wood glanced at Professor McGonagall, who offered a single nod. Immediately, Wood produced 2 gleaming Nimbus 2000s from the back of the crate. He handed one to Harry, while Sherlock vaulted onto the other and kicked off, ascending into the crisp autumn air. He beckoned Harry to follow. From the ground, Wood folded his arms, admiration gleaming in his eyes. In one effortless liftoff, Sherlock had demonstrated precisely why he was extraordinary, and Harry, balancing beside him in midair, sensed that he too had the makings of a natural flyer. As captain of Gryffindor's Quidditch team, Wood knew raw talent when he saw it. "Sherlock," Harry panted, gripping his broom's handle, "what do we do next?" Without a word, Sherlock slipped something from an inner pocket and held it up, allowing the sunlight to catch its surface. The small glass sphere shimmered with an iridescent glow. "Look," Sherlock said. Harry's heart skipped. "Neville's Remembrall? How did you get it?" he blurted, astonished. At a single glance, he recognized the heirloom orb, the very one Neville had dropped in class. Sherlock offered no answer, only a faint, inscrutable smile as he hovered above the Quidditch pitch, the Remembrall cradled in his hand. Below them, Oliver Wood's mouth hung open in disbelief. The afternoon's impromptu flying lesson was turning out to be far more extraordinary than anyone had anticipated. "I grabbed it from him on our way to Professor McGonagall's office." Harry stared, incredulous. "But we were together. When did you?" "That doesn't matter," Sherlock cut in coolly, slipping Neville's Remembrall out of his coat pocket. "Your only task right now is to make sure it doesn't hit the ground." "Huh?" Harry's brow furrowed. "But you're holding it. How could it possibly?" Sherlock offered him a half-smile. "You wouldn't want Neville to burst into tears because his Remembrall shattered, would you?" A cold dread curled in Harry's stomach. Before he could form another question, Sherlock's voice rang out. "Go!" With no warning, Sherlock flung the delicate glass sphere skyward. Everything happened in a heartbeat. Harry's instincts kicked in before his mind even registered what was happening. He tipped his broom downward and plummeted after the soaring ball of enchanted glass. Gravity and magic combined, and he hurtled toward the ground at a terrifying speed, broom bristles whistling in the wind as the Remembrall tumbled ahead of him. Harry stretched out a hand, determination hardening his grip. He couldn't let it fall. Not after what Sherlock had said, not for Neville's sake, and not if he could stop it. At that moment, Harry could still hear Ron's terrified screams mixing with the wind's high-pitched whistle, but he felt no hint of panic. In fact, he was almost exhilarated. With perfect timing, he snatched the glass sphere from the air just a foot above the ground. He leveled his broom and let it drift down until it settled gently on the grass, the Remembrall held snugly in his palm. Only then did he notice Sherlock standing beside him, having somehow touched down without anyone noticing. Harry opened his mouth to speak, but a roar cut him off. "Potter!" Professor McGonagall stormed onto the pitch, wand still raised, her hands slick with sweat, so close to casting a saving spell. "In all my years at Hogwarts," she gasped, "I have never—" Sherlock stepped forward, an eyebrow lifted. "How dare you?" he said crisply. "You nearly gave him a broken neck." Harry stared at them both, utterly speechless. "Whatever," he said would have sounded wrong. Fortunately, Sherlock continued for him. "Professor," he said, voice calm and level, "I think this demonstration is ample proof of Mr. Potter's talent." His composed tone stood in stark contrast to McGonagall's rattled outrage, leaving the entire pitch holding its breath. Chapter 7. The Remembrall's Close Call. Harry's breath came in ragged gasps as he plummeted toward the pitch, the small glass Remembrall spiraling above him. A volley of errant spells chased him, each one threatening to send him, and the Remembrall crashing to the ground. His knuckles went white on the grips of his broken broom. Then a calm voice cut through the chaos. "Sherlock Holmes." Before Harry had time to register the name, Sherlock swept in beside him, wand outstretched. With a few swift incantations, the spells shifted direction and exploded harmlessly into the brick wall of the stands. In the next heartbeat, Sherlock caught the remembrall as it tumbled through the air, holding it steady in his gloved hand. Harry landed on the grass, legs weak with relief. He swallowed hard, his gratitude as bright as the remembrall's glow. Professor McGonagall stormed onto the pitch, robes billowing behind her. "Endangering a student? Did you think that was permissible, Mr. Holmes? If anything had happened to Potter, you would have been held entirely responsible." Sherlock met her gaze without flinching. "He'll be fine. I trust his reflexes, and I trust you, Professor, even more." McGonagall's stern expression faltered, and she pressed a hand to her throat. After a moment of hesitation, her lips curved into a reluctant smile. Remarkable, a true genius. Before she could gather herself entirely, Oliver Wood bounded over, breathless and wide-eyed. A 50-foot dive at full tilt, and he caught that thing without a scratch. Charlie Weasley couldn't have done better. He seized Harry's hand, still clutching the remembrall, with unbridled enthusiasm. His eyes shone with the single-minded obsession of a born Quidditch captain. "Professor, we simply must get him a proper broom. Nimbus 2000, or perhaps a shooting star. No, it has to be a Nimbus 2000. McGonagall exchanged a glance with Sherlock, then with Wood, her earlier wrath melting into a spark of excitement. The three of them stood there on the green pitch, united by the exhilarating promise of Harry Potter's destiny as a Seeker. Oliver Wood's eyes flashed with determination. "But Potter's only a first-year student." Professor McGonagall began hesitantly. "That's not a problem," Wood thundered, sweeping his hand through the air as though clearing away any objections. "Professor, you'll have to speak to Dumbledore yourself, and see if we can't make an exception for a first year. If you won't go, I will. We need a stronger Quidditch team than last year, and Harry here is exactly what we need." He turned to Harry, grin widening. "On behalf of the Gryffindor squad, I welcome you aboard, Harry. As captain, I'm officially informing you that practice starts next week." Professor McGonagall stood by, blinking in surprise. Watching Wood transform at the mere mention of Quidditch, she felt almost unnecessary, and yet she couldn't deny his enthusiasm was contagious. Nor could she deny that Harry Potter displayed a remarkable talent with a broomstick. Clearing her throat, she addressed Harry in her crisp, no-nonsense tone. "Potter!" Harry stiffened, snapping to attention. "I expect to hear that you've been training hard, otherwise I shall change my mind and revoke the invitation." Harry's heart pounded in his chest. He had, by some extraordinary stroke of luck, just been allowed to join the Gryffindor Quidditch team as a first year, and with Wood's unwavering faith behind him, there was no turning back now. "You must keep this under wraps," Wood insisted, eyes gleaming. "He's the youngest house team player in a century, and our secret weapon." Wood's triumphant grin said he'd already counted the house cup as good as one. Sherlock, however, merely raised an eyebrow. He doubted such news would stay hidden for long. "Hopefully," he muttered, more to himself than to anyone else. Professor McGonagall cleared her throat and turned to him. "Mr. Holmes, Harry's intervention did spare you demerits and saved you from detention, but that in no way justifies your reckless behavior." Sherlock sighed inwardly, already bracing for her next instruction. True to form, McGonagall seized the moment. "And another thing," she continued, voice firm, "I will not tolerate you missing Professor Quirrell's Defense Against the Dark Arts class again. Understood?" Sherlock met her gaze and answered with surprising calm. "Yes, Professor." McGonagall's lips pressed together in a thin line. She'd half expected the notorious maverick to push back. Instead, his immediate compliance left her oddly disappointed. Chapter 42, Busy Sherlock. Sherlock didn't even try to resist. Between Professor McGonagall's firm tone and her unshakable resolve, he'd already concluded there was no point in arguing. As someone well-versed in psychology, he knew that a show of defiance often only amuses and further motivates the person in control. "Potter," Professor McGonagall said, turning back to Harry now that Sherlock had fallen into line, "your father would be very proud of you. He was an outstanding Quidditch player in his day." A genuine smile spread across her face. Harry blinked in surprise. He hadn't seen Professor McGonagall look so happy all term. Even when Sherlock and Hermione had scored points for Gryffindor and Transfiguration, her approval had been nothing more than a polite, reserved nod. But now, over his joining the Quidditch team, she positively beamed. It was clear she had a kind heart, though Harry couldn't help wishing she might ease up on the homework, just a little. The common room buzzed with excitement. With the last selection made, the Gryffindor Quidditch team at last felt complete. Cheers and chatter filled the air. Everything was falling perfectly into place. Then Ron cleared his throat, voice a little wobbly. Aren't you forgetting someone?" All eyes turned to him. Ron had been all but invisible beside Harry and Sherlock during the entire tryout, but now he stood, hand raised, determination gleaming in his green eyes. "What about me?" Professor McGonagall exchanged a curious glance with Oliver Wood, the team's captain. Neither of them had paid Ron much heed. He'd barely spoken up since the first mention of joining Charlie Weasley on the pitch, but here he was, insisting on his chance. "I've been playing Quidditch with Charlie since we were kids," Ron said, voice firm. "I deserve a spot on the team, too." Wood arched an eyebrow. "Is that so? Think you've got Potter's kind of talent?" Ron's cheeks went scarlet, part annoyance, part embarrassment, but he refused to back down. "I do." "Very well," Wood said, a half-smile breaking across his face. "Let's see it. Take him up for a trial flight." "Right." Ron practically sprinted outside to grab a broom. Moments later, he was soaring above the pitch, weaving through imaginary bludgers, executing sharp turns and graceful dives. Every eye tracked his every move, and by the time he landed, applause had erupted around him. "Well done," Wood said, clapping Ron on the back. "Welcome to the team." McGonagall nodded in approval. "I think we've found ourselves a new chaser." Ron's grin threatened to split his face in two. At last, he'd earned his place on the Gryffindor squad. Wood watched Ron climb higher, twisting and banking at daring angles. Then, with a sudden burst of confidence, Ron launched into a series of audacious stunts he'd longed to but never dared to, looping through the sky, diving with thrilling precision. To Wood's keen eye, Ron's performance was commendable for a first year, yet it fell short of the excellence he deemed necessary for an immediate spot on the team, certainly nowhere near Harry's level. He landed softly on the pitch, and Wood wasted no time with pleasantries. "You've got potential, Weasley, but not quite enough to make the team right now." Ron's shoulders slumped, and his face turned a shade of mortified red. Harry hurried over, ready with a few encouraging words, but Wood's sharp voice cut in before he could speak. "Holmes, what about you? Care to give it a try?" Harry froze mid-approach, brows raised in surprise. Ron scowled. Neither dared meet Wood's gaze, but the coach paid them no mind. He'd only asked because he remembered Holmes's earlier display, a single, flawless somersault above the pitch that had been meant to highlight Harry's talent, but had revealed something remarkable in Holmes himself. If anyone could outfly Ron, it was him. Holmes reached out casually to grip the handle of a nearby broomstick, then let it drop with a quiet shake of his head. "No, I'm not interested." Wood sighed and shrugged. "Ed, fine. Potter's on the team. That's enough aerial talent for now." He turned away, already moving on to the next item on his agenda. Coach Wood still had pressing obligations elsewhere. Sherlock's refusal left Wood with a flicker of regret, but the team's most urgent need was a seeker, and Harry was unquestionably the right choice. Sherlock might have made an excellent player, but Gryffindor's needs at other positions weren't nearly as pressing. With Harry secured and Sherlock unwilling, Coach Wood dropped the subject. Their top priority now was to train Harry as quickly as possible. After Sherlock, Harry and Ron left the Quidditch pitch, Professor McGonagall opened her mouth to speak, only to be cut off by Wood's anxious question. "Professor, when will you meet with Headmaster Dumbledore? We must finalize Harry's spot on the team." McGonagall gave him a gentle but firm look. "That's quite enough, Wood. We'll approach Dumbledore in due course," she said, raising a hand to still his urgings. Once they were clear of the stadium, Ron turned to Sherlock. "Honestly, Sherlock, I appreciate that you refused on my behalf, but it was a rare chance. Opportunities like that don't come around twice." Sherlock regarded him calmly. "I think you've got the wrong idea, Ron. I didn't say no because of you. I simply can't commit to 3 training sessions a week. It's nothing personal." Sherlock stopped in his tracks and turned to Ron with an unflinching stare. Whether I make the Gryffindor Quidditch team or not doesn't change the fact that you won't be selected." Ron's face fell so fast, Harry half expected dust to scatter from his shoulders. He opened his mouth, then shut it, blinking in disbelief. Harry stepped between them. "Sherlock, do you really have to be that blunt?" Sherlock regarded him coolly over the brim of his spectacles. "My dear Harry, I've told you before, I neither lie nor sugarcoat facts unless it's absolutely necessary." Harry cleared his throat. "Well, I'd argue this is one of those necessary situations." Sherlock shook his head, as if dispensing wisdom rather than criticism. "No, to lie purely to spare Ron's feelings would only encourage unrealistic expectations. There's no shame in lacking a particular talent. Recognizing one's limitations early on saves a great deal of wasted effort. Better to focus on goals within reach than waste time chasing impossibilities." Harry opened his mouth, then closed it again. Sherlock's logic was bulletproof and frighteningly sensible. Harry found himself nodding, even as his heart ached for Ron. Sherlock's brutal honesty served truth, but it was hard on a friend's pride. If he kept this up, he'd alienate everyone around him. Fortunately, Ron's disappointment lasted only a moment. He let out a half-hearted grin and shrugged. "Well, I suppose I'll just have to find something else I'm good at." Harry squeezed his shoulder. "That's the spirit." As they resumed walking down the corridor, Sherlock followed, a solitary figure marching to the beat of unvarnished reason. The moment that sumptuous dinner appeared before him, Sherlock promptly set everything else aside. It was time to eat. Over the next month, he buried himself in work. Most days found him deep in conversation with the professors whose courses interested him. After all, mastering an entirely new magic system, absorbing its principles, reconciling them with one's own methods, was no small feat. Even a genius like Sherlock Holmes had to devote hours of study to it. His earlier plans to explore the Forbidden Forest and investigate the Chamber of Secrets were quietly shelved. Instead, he honored the promise he'd made to Professor McGonagall. He would never again skip Defense Against the Dark Arts. Unfortunately, Professor Quirrell's lectures were excruciatingly dull, little more than a lifeless reading of the textbook. In contrast, Professor Binns, the ghostly history of magic instructor, at least tried to engage with students' questions, even if his hearing was so poor that he repeatedly asked, "G, L, Gryffindor, S, till." The occasional back and forth was infinitely more bearable than Quirrell's monotone drone. In stark contrast, whenever anyone pressed Professor Quirrell with a question, he'd dodge it, or drift off into vague remarks about the weather. If the questioning persisted, his face would flush bright red, his eyes would flicker nervously, and he'd look thoroughly terrified. It was nearly impossible to reconcile this trembling man with the brilliant Ravenclaw star he'd once been. Whispers among the faculty claimed that Quirrell's breakdown dated back to his encounters with vampires and dark witches in the Forbidden Forest. But Sherlock's own observations suggested something far more unsettling had happened to the professor. Some secret he was desperate to keep hidden. Still, Sherlock had little desire to pry. After all, Dumbledore sat on countless secrets, as did McGonagall, Snape, Flitwick, Sprout, Hagrid, even Filch. At Hogwarts, it was said every staff member harbored a mystery or two. Unless it spilled into actual criminal territory, Sherlock had better things to occupy his mind. The next matter on his agenda was Harry. Chapter 43. You've lowered the IQ of the entire school. As Sherlock had warned before term began, carrying the name Harry Potter guaranteed he'd be at the eye of every storm. Even if he tried to keep his head down, trouble seemed to find him. Now, nearly 2 months in, he'd already endured no end of mishaps. Gaggles of overly enthusiastic students practically tackling him in the corridors, Peeves popping up at every turn, determined to torment him. Wandering into a forbidden, pitch-black wing, explicitly off-limits by Dumbledore's decree, and being collared by Filch, who refused to let him go. The castle's moving staircases, shifting without warning. Draco Malfoy deliberately goading him at every opportunity. Admittedly, none of these incidents had spun out of control while Sherlock was around. Sherlock could untangle anything, until he couldn't. The moment he left Harry to fend for himself, the chaos resumed. Ron's presence or absence made no difference. He was rarely any help. And Malfoy's behavior? It was less mere mischief and more like active warfare. as if he'd made it his sole mission to make Harry miserable. Remarkably, though, after Sherlock had spoken to Malfoy on the train, leaving the Slytherin looking thoroughly chastened, Draco had, at least temporarily, fallen silent. Slytherin life had clearly bolstered Draco Malfoy's confidence. About a month into term, he began taunting Harry once more, but he still feared Sherlock Holmes. He knew all too well that Crabbe and Goyle together wouldn't stand a chance against Sherlock's razor-sharp mind and uncanny reflexes. So Malfoy chose a more devious approach. He challenged Harry to a formal duel. It happened one morning in the Great Hall. With all the subtlety of a rattlesnake, Draco slid into the seat opposite Harry. "I propose a duel," he announced, voice dripping with sly triumph. "You and me, one-on-one. No witnesses, no interference." Harry blinked, half afraid to hope Sherlock would leap to his defense, but Sherlock merely raised an eyebrow and set down his pumpkin juice with casual interest. Wizard dueling wasn't in his usual bailiwick, and the idea of dissecting its rules and tactics sparked his curiosity. Before Harry could muster a response, Ron Weasley, reddish-haired, freckled, brimming with bravado, leapt from his seat. "I'll be Harry's second," he declared, thumping his chest. Turning to Malfoy, he added, "Midnight trophy room. That's where we'll meet you." Draco allowed himself a thin-smiled nod. "You'll find me there." With that, he swept away, Crabbe and Goyle looming at his heels. Harry sat frozen, the words echoing in his mind. A midnight duel in the trophy room? It felt like one of Fred and George's pranks, but this was all too real. Once Malfoy and his cronies had gone, Harry rubbed his temples. Sherlock, already on his feet, intercepted Ron in a nearby corridor. "Explain the rules," he said crisply. Ron launched into an enthusiastic and occasionally tangled account of seconds, wand work, parry and riposte, and the subtle art of scoring a clean hit without crossing the line into hexes that might leave permanent damage. Sherlock listened with laser focus, cataloging each detail in his mind. By the time Ron finished, the protagonist of this impromptu drama was clear. Come midnight, in the silent grandeur of the trophy room, Harry would face Malfoy in a duel, and Sherlock Holmes would be watching every movement, ready to test his newly acquired theories on the arcane science of wizarding combat. The rules of engagement. Ron cleared his throat and addressed Harry's question. "A wizard's duel is more than just a fight. It's a formal, ritualized contest that's been part of wizarding culture for centuries." Harry frowned, glancing at Sherlock. "That really is it?" he asked, surprised by how simply Sherlock had explained it. Sherlock inclined his head. "Yes, it's essentially modeled on medieval knightly duels, except that both sides wield magic instead of swords." He waved a hand dismissively. "It's a pity real chivalry has all but vanished these days. But enough of that. Are you sure you want to be Harry's second? According to duel protocol, if one duelist falls, the assistant must step in and continue the match." Harry's face went pale. Before he could protest, Ron jumped in, hoping to calm him down. "Don't worry, mate. You and Malfoy wouldn't know enough serious magic to actually harm each other. At worst, you'll send a few sparks flying." Harry let out a shaky breath and looked to Sherlock with fresh anxiety. "What if I wave my wand and nothing happens?" Sherlock offered a wry smile. "Then you ditch the wand and punch him in the nose." Ron's eyes widened. Sherlock, maybe let's keep it nonviolent." Harry stared at Sherlock, desperation in his eyes. "Please," he whispered. "Anything but." Sherlock simply shrugged and met Harry's gaze evenly. "Trust me, you'll manage." "Good call," Sherlock said with uncharacteristic solemnity. "Sometimes to achieve your goal, you can't let convention tie your hands." Ron's eyes lit up. Sherlock's support was a rare and welcome thing. "But if it were me, I wouldn't go today," he declared, suddenly brimming with confidence. "Why not?" Harry asked. Ron puffed up. "Refusing a duel may sound cowardly, but charging in headfirst is un-Gryffindor. Bravery, after all, is just foolishness dressed in scarlet and gold." Sherlock arched an eyebrow. "Precisely. And here's my wager. Malfoy has no intention of showing up. Harry, I'll bet you a galleon that if you march over to the dueling stage, you'll find Filch waiting to haul you off." Harry went pale. "That's impossible. Filch would never." "Don't underestimate Argus Filch," Sherlock continued, "and don't overestimate Draco Malfoy. He may be from one of the sacred 28 families, but he's never struck me as a man of action." "Shut up, Ron," Sherlock snapped. You're dragging the school's collective IQ into the dungeon. Ron opened his mouth, closed it, and then muttered, "Sorry." Sherlock turned back to Harry. Think about it. When Malfoy mentioned bringing a second, he only named one, either Crabbe or Goyle. If he really intended to duel you, he'd have had a proper strategy, not a last-minute tag-along. He's counting on you storming in alone. Harry swallowed. So you're saying it's a trap? Exactly, Sherlock said in a low voice. And I'm afraid our dear caretaker is the one setting it. Harry shared a glance with Ron, whose nerves were suddenly a tangled mess. Then what do we do? He asked. Sherlock leaned back, steepling his fingers. We outthink the trap. We'll go together and ensure the only surprise waiting for Filch is finding nothing but empty dueling blankets. Sherlock's eyes narrowed as he addressed Harry and Ron. Malfoy's excuse was nothing more than a diversion, designed to lead you into a trap he'd already set. He tried to hide it, but anyone paying attention could have spotted the slight limp in his right leg. He must have picked up an injury during flying practice. Harry and Ron exchanged blank looks. They'd been in yesterday's lesson and remembered Malfoy on his broomstick, but neither had noticed anything wrong. Harry kicked himself inwardly. Was this the old seeing versus observing lesson all over again? Sherlock pressed on. And think back to when you chose your assistant. Malfoy's reaction to your picking Ron instead of me was strangely muted. If I'd been in his shoes, if he'd truly planned to challenge you, I'd have felt at least a twinge of relief. Yet he showed nothing. Ron scowled at the implication. He simply didn't care who stood at your side, Sherlock concluded, because he never intended to duel you in the first place. And all that talk about the so-called Sacred 28? Pure self-important drivel. Sherlock's lip curled in contempt. Honestly, with their obsession over ancient bloodlines, sometimes the wizarding world can't help but seem stuck in the Dark Ages. With that, he turned on his heel, leaving Harry and Ron to digest a very different view of Draco Malfoy, and a very different threat than they had expected. Sherlock's influence on Harry remained just as powerful, and in the end, he talked him out of the duel. His reasoning proved flawless. By morning, Malfoy never even mentioned it. Instead, he looked genuinely shocked when Harry and Ron walked into the Great Hall completely unscathed. Ron, watching Draco's astonished face, felt a rush of relief that Harry had listened to Sherlock. In the common room the night before, he'd practically been dragging Harry toward the dueling stage, only to be firmly rebuffed. Of course, Ron would never admit that now. He seized the moment to mercilessly taunt Malfoy, and with Fred and George spreading the story throughout Hogwarts, word that Draco had cowardly backed out of a duel with Harry rippled through the school in no time. Since then, Malfoy hasn't held his head high. At the same time, our Gryffindor housemates gained a new appreciation for Sherlock. Soon, students began bringing him every kind of puzzle or inconvenience that cropped up in daily life. Sherlock welcomed each challenge. Every one was a chance to learn more about the magical world. His most frequent visitor proved to be Neville Longbottom, who shared a dormitory corridor with him. Neville's pet toad, Trevor, kept vanishing at the most inconvenient moments, and Sherlock seemed almost as determined to find Trevor as Neville himself. Malfoy refused to stay humiliated for long. The moment one scheme collapsed, he was already hatching another, his sharp gaze never leaving Harry as he waited for the perfect moment to strike. And in due time, that moment finally arrived. Chapter 44, 3 Things. It was a seemingly ordinary morning in the Great Hall. As always, owls streamed in, swooping down from the high windows to deliver their messages. But today, 6 tawny owls descended together, carrying between them a single long, slender package. For a moment, everyone's attention snapped to the unusual sight. Harry watched it land. Even Sherlock glanced up, then immediately turned his gaze away. Ron, on the other hand, barely registered the commotion. He was too busy devouring his breakfast. Harry leaned toward Sherlock, ready to ask what was happening, but before he could, the owls flapped a few more yards and dropped the package right in front of him. One end of it knocked Harry's bacon off his plate and onto the floor. "What on earth is this?" Harry muttered, astonished. Ron finally paused mid-bite. He reached out to open the package, brows furrowed in curiosity, until Sherlock's calm voice stopped him. "If I were you, I wouldn't touch it." Instantly, Ron jerked his hand back. No sooner had the 6 owls flown off than another, a sleek, gray-feathered bird, glided down and dropped a letter on top of the mysterious parcel. Without waiting, Harry picked up the envelope. He was about to tear it open when Ron's hand shot out to stop him. "Wait, can I open it?" Ron asked, glancing at Sherlock for guidance. Harry rolled his eyes. He'd seen this kind of reaction from Ron before. An overcorrection, so extreme it was almost as funny as it was exasperating. But he said nothing, and all eyes turned to Sherlock as the hall fell into a tense hush. "Open it. I'm almost certain it's Professor McGonagall's gift to you." Harry didn't bother asking how Sherlock had worked it out. He tore open the envelope with shaking hands and unfolded a single sheet of paper, at the top of which were just a few neatly penned lines. "Do not open the parcel on the table. It contains your new broom, the Nimbus 2000. I would rather the rest of the school remain unaware you have one, lest they all decide they want it too. Oliver Wood will expect you at the Quidditch pitch at 7 this evening for your first training session. By the way, Mr. Holmes's package has also arrived. Please be sure to pass it on to him." Harry felt a surge of excitement, but forced himself to remain calm. He folded the note and handed it to Sherlock and Ron. Sherlock's eyebrows lifted in surprise. Though he'd guessed from the parcel's shape and weight that it was a gift from Professor McGonagall, he hadn't realized she'd sent along a delivery for him as well. Harry's eyes lit up the moment he saw it. A Nimbus 2000. Ron's voice was thick with envy. "I've never even touched one before." Harry offered Ron a conspiratorial grin. "Don't worry, you can have all the practice you want this season." Then, turning to Sherlock, he asked, "So what's in your package?" Sherlock's expression was as unreadable as ever. "A violin. It's a gift from my family." For a heartbeat, Ron and Harry just stared. Then Ron blurted, "You play the violin too?" Harry let out a low whistle. "Boxing, fencing, detective work, and now music? Is there anything you don't do?" Instead of answering, Sherlock cocked his head. "Tell me, do you find violin music unbearably loud?" Harry shook his head, bracing himself. "No. Trust me, I've survived the Dursleys. Aunt Petunia's cupboard banging alone is enough to damage your ears. Uncle Vernon's yelling and Dudley's tantrums, those were the real noise." Ron cleared his throat. "Well, a violin's volume really depends on the player. A master can make it sing like an angel, but if the violinist's no good..." Sherlock cut in with a faint smile. "Then you needn't worry." Harry and Ron exchanged glances. For someone so understated, Sherlock certainly sounded confident. Whatever was coming next, it promised to be interesting. Harry, Ron, and Sherlock exchanged a few words before hurrying off together. Harry and Ron eager to find a quiet corner in which to inspect their mysterious deliveries. After only a couple of steps, though, Sherlock abruptly stopped and glanced over his shoulder. "Something wrong?" Harry asked, concern flickering in his voice. "Nothing," Sherlock replied, though his eyes were sharp with suspicion. "Let's keep moving." He'd sensed they were being followed, but he dismissed the tale as inconsequential. Ever since an owl had dropped a slender, wrapped parcel at Harry's feet, Draco Malfoy had been watching. The moment the three of them departed, Malfoy had enlisted Crabbe and Goyle to trail them, curiosity and envy driving his every step. From a safe distance, Malfoy watched Harry unwrap the package. When the broomstick emerged, Malfoy could barely contain his excitement. Every Hogwarts first year knew that brooms were strictly off-limits until later years. Malfoy himself had gone to great lengths and spectacular failures trying to smuggle a broom onto school grounds before term began. Now, with Harry holding one in his hands, Malfoy saw his chance at last, and he was determined not to let it slip away. Draco Malfoy practically burst into Professor Snape's office, eager to gloat over what he was certain would be Harry Potter's downfall. In his mind, Snape already despised Harry, and here was the perfect excuse to drag him off to detention, if not expulsion outright. Even Sherlock Holmes's legendary talents, Draco thought, would count for nothing against such clear-cut evidence. Instead of triumph, Draco was met with a scowl. "Mr. Malfoy," Snape said coldly, "I suggest you mind your own business." Draco stood frozen, his victory evaporating. He had no inkling that the gleaming broomstick Harry gripped, the brand-new Nimbus 2000, was actually a gift from Professor McGonagall. Sherlock's quiet intervention had convinced her that Harry deserved every advantage, and after hearing Oliver Wood's enthusiastic praise for the broom, McGonagall had even paid for it herself. To avoid any awkward surprises, she'd informed several colleagues in advance, Snape included. So when Draco burst in, eager to report Harry's misdeed, Snape saw only a boy meddling where he didn't belong. Draco's carefully crafted scheme unraveled faster than he could believe, and not because of any detective prowess, but simply because he'd picked the wrong fight. Draco Malfoy came back to the shop, glum and defeated. Crabbe and Goyle, still in the dark about what had really happened, rushed up to him just as Harry and Ron were finishing their inspection of the brooms and the violin. Naturally, the two heavies stepped in front of the boys, hoping to keep them from leaving. They glanced nervously toward the door, remembering all too well Sherlock's last demonstration of magical muscle. At that moment, Draco planted himself between his lackeys and the Weasleys. Crabbe and Goyle straightened with renewed confidence and sneered at Harry. "Potter, you're finished this time." Draco, however, raised a pale hand. "Let them go." Crabbe and Goyle froze. "What?" Crabbe spluttered. "But Draco, he's got a broom, a Nimbus 2000, didn't you tell us?" "I said let them go," Draco repeated in a low, clipped voice. Harry and Ron exchanged triumphant looks. Without a word from Sherlock, they knew exactly what had happened. Harry fought back a laugh at Draco's mortified expression, and Ron pressed his advantage. "Nice of you to show up, Malfoy. Your Comet 260's pretty sweet, if you don't mind riding second best." Malfoy flushed scarlet. He snarled at Ron, deprivation and bravado warring in his voice. "Shut up, Weasley. You wouldn't be able to afford half the handle of a Nimbus." With that, Draco stepped aside, Crabbe and Goyle reluctantly parted, and Harry and Ron strolled out, leaving the two Slytherins fuming in their wake. "You and your brothers have to scrape and save, twig by twig, just to afford a broomstick, don't you? What was that?" "Dare you say it again?" Sherlock paused at the sound of their rising voices. He watched the quarrel with mild amusement, shaking his head at their childish squabbling, but then reminded himself that at 11 years old, this was perfectly normal behavior. In comparison, he was the odd one out. Glancing around, he spotted Hermione making her way across the courtyard, with Professor Flitwick close behind. Satisfied that these youngsters wouldn't get themselves into serious trouble, Sherlock turned on his heel and followed Hermione instead. He'd promised her private flying lessons, and she was the third commitment filling his schedule today. From what he'd seen so far, Hermione's talent on a broomstick was even more remarkable than he'd anticipated. With a quiet confidence that belied her age, she was already mastering maneuvers that had taken others weeks to learn. As they prepared to head to the pitch for their lesson, Sherlock allowed himself a small, approving smile. This, at least, was going to be worth his time. Chapter 45. Sherlock Comes to the Rescue. In every world, people have their blind spots. Some are hopeless at sprinting, others struggle with memorization. No matter how hard they try, words and passages slip through their minds like water through a sieve. A few stumble over reading aloud, tripping on their tongues even after countless rehearsals, and a precious few can't seem to grasp what they hear in class until exam day comes, and then, suddenly, nothing makes sense. Beyond these, there are those who simply can't get the hang of studying itself. Hermione Granger, celebrated for her brilliance in almost every subject, transformed into an entirely different person in flying class. Where she normally exhibited confidence and poise, atop her broom she became jittery, tentative, her insecurities laid bare for everyone to see. With each failed attempt, her cheeks burned brighter, and the more she labored to master takeoff and landing, the more flustered she grew. Watching his friend's distress, Sherlock Holmes refused to stand by. He decided to tackle Hermione's problem head-on. Over the next several days, he dedicated himself to patient, hands-on instruction, analyzing her posture, breaking down her breathing, and guiding her focus away from her fear of heights and toward the mechanics of flight. Slowly, steadily, Hermione's confidence began to rebuild. By the end of their sessions, Hermione no longer trembled at the prospect of climbing onto her broom. Though many people harbor at least a touch of acrophobia, Sherlock's methodical coaching had given her the tools to rise above her fear and to soar. Chapter 7. Confronting the Heights. Acrophobia manifests in many ways. For some people, it's only a mild unease. For others, it's a paralyzing terror. In fact, most of us assume we don't suffer from a fear of heights, simply because we've never reached the altitude that tips us over the edge. After observing Hermione's reactions and applying his trademark deduction, Sherlock concluded that her fear was a textbook case of specific phobia, and one that could be overcome through careful, progressive exposure. He proposed a series of flying lessons on broomsticks, each session held at a slightly greater height than the last. Their goal was simple: stay aloft at the threshold of Hermione's terror for at least 30 minutes each time, then come down only once she'd regained some composure. At first, the effort embarrassed Hermione more than anything. She would flush pink as soon as they climbed a few dozen feet above the castle turrets. But embarrassment soon gave way to sheer panic. Above a certain altitude, she would begin to shake from head to toe, her hands and feet growing ice cold, her heart racing so violently that even winter's chill in the air couldn't stop her from breaking into a cold sweat. Tears would slip unbidden down her cheeks, and on more than one occasion she'd black out completely. Sherlock, ever vigilant, managed to catch her each time her knees buckled, preventing what would have been a catastrophic fall from 100 feet in the air. But after 2 or 3 close calls, Hermione flatly declared that she'd had enough. "I can't do this," she whispered one afternoon, voice trembling so badly Sherlock could barely make it out. "It's too much." Sherlock landed the broomstick smoothly a short distance from the castle wall. He turned to her, calm and unruffled, and said, "You're doing precisely what you need to do, Thu. Facing it, instead of running. That is how you beat a phobia." He offered her a hand, steady and reassuring. "One step at a time, Hermione. We'll take it slower if we have to, but you will fly." Despite her exhaustion, a spark of determination lit in Hermione's eyes. She clasped his hand and stood. "All right," she said, her voice steadier now. "Let's try again." But when Hermione caught Sherlock's casual indifference, and the faint suggestion that he'd prefer her to give up, she pressed her lips together and refused to back down. After all, of all her peers, he was the only one she truly wanted to re-atch. Nearly 2 months into the term, her friendships with her roommates, and really with the whole class, remained frostier than she liked. She could feel the barrier. Like in the Muggle world, her classmates saw her as know-it-all, preachy, too concerned with rules and grades. Honest advice grates on the ear, she reminded herself. And teenage wizards, who wouldn't even listen to their own parents, were the last ones to welcome lectures from a fellow student. Arriving at Hogwarts hadn't softened opinions. In Gryffindor, where daring often trumps discipline, Hermione's obsession with perfection set her apart. Just look at the Weasley twins. True, young lions, everyone agreed, but hardly the poster boys for rule-following. Still, Hermione clung to her standards, determined that somewhere beneath their jokes and jibes lay the genuine respect, and perhaps even friendship, she longed for. Hermione winced every time someone called Gryffindors reckless troublemakers. It was a tiresome stereotype, but lately it seemed to be getting under everyone's skin, including her own. She'd already clashed uncomfortably with classmates over it, and even Harry and Ron weren't immune. The latest flashpoint was Malfoy's challenge. He dared Harry to a late-night wizard's duel. Hermione overheard the rumors and cornered them both the next day. "You absolutely must not wander the castle after hours," she hissed, pacing back and forth. "If you get caught, how many points will Gryffindor lose? And trust me, you will get caught. It's selfish and stupid." She meant well, but her delivery was harsh and, she admitted, more than a little itchy under her own skin. Determined to spare them both and the house from disaster, she staged a midnight vigil by the fat lady's portrait to see if they'd really sneak off. Of course, Harry, having taken Sherlock's advice to heart, never showed up. Ron stayed behind as well, so Hermione's stakeout solved precisely nothing. Still, her night wasn't a total waste. As she stood freezing in the corridor, she spotted Neville Longbottom, desperately rattling the doorknocker. He'd forgotten the common room password. With a relieved smile, Hermione guided him through the portrait hole and into the warmth of the Gryffindor Tower, her accidental good deed of the evening. The next morning, Harry and Ron arrived at breakfast with disbelief etched on their faces. Neville had relayed every detail of Hermione's confrontation with Malfoy, and they couldn't fathom that anyone, least of all Hermione, would meddle so boldly. Their surprise quickly curdled into irritation. Ron even seized the chance to spread the rumor that Malfoy had backed down from a duel, proudly adding, "And Hermione's the one who turned him tail." Word traveled fast among the first-year Gryffindors, and within hours Hermione found herself shunned. No one would pass her the salt at dinner. No one would volunteer an answer in charms if she'd raised her hand. Only Neville, ever grateful for her kindness on the train, finding Trevor, his lost toad, and rescuing him from the tower corridors, still treated her warmly. More surprisingly, Sherlock Holmes, too, remained unfazed. He greeted her each morning with a curt, "Good day, Hermione," and continued their weekly one-on-one study sessions as if nothing had changed. To him, a bit of social friction was trivial. Hermione watched him once, curious and a little wounded, and finally asked, "Don't you care what everyone thinks?" Sherlock turned a cool, thoughtful gaze on her. "If you're convinced you're right," he said simply, "why worry about being popular?" He shrugged. "I spent years at my old school in the Muggle world exactly the way you're living now. People kept their distance. It hardly ever stopped me from doing what needed doing." His words sank in, and though Hermione still ached from the rejection around her, she felt a new resolve kindle. With Neville and Sherlock by her side, she wouldn't need the approval of the crowd to stand by her convictions. Despite his bluntness and habit of calling out people, ease mistakes without a second thought, Sherlock couldn't have cared less what anyone thought of him. Over the years, a handful of classmates had tried to pick on him, spilling ink on his homework, slipping beetles into his pencil case, even tampering with his breakfast, but every prank inexplicably backfired. One culprit opened his bag to find ink-smeared textbooks and a live toad. Another salted his porridge so heavily he nearly gagged. A few tough boys who dared to rough him up physically soon stopped after losing a couple of front teeth. Sherlock's knack for brushing off other people's opinions left Hermione burning with envy. How she wished she could be that unfazed, but try as she might, she just couldn't. She sat at her desk, knuckles white around her quill, utterly distracted. "If you're really that troubled," Sherlock said at last, leaning forward, "I do have a suggestion." He studied Hermione's anxious expression, determined to understand the problem from her point of view. "You could try not to place so much importance on grades." "How am I supposed to do that?" Hermione blurted, her model student instincts flaring. "Professor Snape deducts points at the slightest excuse. If we don't follow every rule—" "Miss Granger," Sherlock interrupted with a slight smile, "your 12 years of life experience simply aren't enough to understand how the world works." Hermione bristled at his tone, but he pressed on. "Here's the reality. You have two choices. Keep doing everything your way and stop worrying about others' opinions. You're not a pound sterling. You can't be everyone's favorite. Or you can shift your mindset and learn to fit in." Despite the sharpness of his words, Hermione recognized their truth. After all, she'd seen Sherlock himself choose the first option time and again, unconcerned with politeness or popularity. Hermione found herself replaying Sherlock's latest excesses in her mind. There was the time he'd turned to Ron and Neville and declared, "You two lower the intelligence of the entire house," or the moment when Dean Thomas simply paused in front of him, only to be met with, "You're disturbing my train of thought." And most recently, Sherlock had felt compelled to remind everyone, "I'm only 12 years old. Remember that." To Hermione, these were far more abrasive than anything she'd done. She was merely enforcing Hogwarts rules, whereas Sherlock seemed to take personal shots at anyone who crossed him. What struck her most was his indifference. No matter how his classmates bristled, he continued unperturbed, marching to his own drumbeat from start to finish. And yet, she had to admit a grudging admiration for him. He practiced what he preached with absolute conviction, something she often struggled to do. Still, after much thought, Hermione realized she couldn't simply follow Sherlock's lead. She respected his single-minded determination, but she would chart her own course and change her situation in her own way. "You can do it. Go ahead." Sherlock's steady encouragement floated to her ears as Hermione hesitated at the classroom door. Under his guidance, she set out to change her fortunes at Hogwarts using her own methods. In every lesson, she raised her hand with more confidence than before, volunteering answers and insights in a determined bid to rack up house points. To her delight, the strategy worked. Within a month, every professor except Snape had lavished Gryffindor with points. Yet despite Hermione's personal haul, nearly 30 points earned single-handedly and the title of top first-year scorer, her classmates' behavior toward her remained unchanged. It wasn't surprising. Hermione's brilliance was beyond question, but so was her fervor for correcting everyone else. She pounced on every mistake, forbade even the smallest sign of homework copying, and reported classmates to professors at the drop of a quill. Everyone admitted she was right, no one liked her. Sherlock could only shrug. He'd given her the best advice he knew, but Hermione, in her zeal to help, had refused to soften her approach. As it turned out, well-intentioned efforts made entirely on one side seldom win the gratitude or affection of the other. No one had asked Hermione for help. In the eyes of the younger Gryffindors, she was nothing more than a meddler. Yet when you become absorbed in a task, time seems to slip away, and suddenly 2 full months had passed since the start of term. Hogwarts itself felt noticeably brighter. The first-year students were about to enjoy their very first school festival, Halloween. Over centuries of celebration, Halloween had long since lost its original religious overtones and become simply a night of revelry. In fact, the festivities spanned 2 days. October 31st is what we now call Halloween, while November 1st is All Saints' Day. When most people say Halloween, they're referring to October 31st, the very evening on which the first years would hold their grand feast. Historically, the night itself was also known as All Hallows' Eve. As the holiday drew near, excited chatter rippled through the castle. Children and teens alike planned their costumes, witches, ghosts, goblins, even dragons, and prepared to wander the corridors, knocking on doors with its traditional refrain, "Trick or treat." Those willing to hand over sweets were spared harmless pranks. Those who refused could expect a mischievous but never dangerous retribution. By the time Halloween arrived, Hogwarts would be alight with laughter, candlelight, and enough sugar to last the year. Legend has it that on Halloween night, ghosts and goblins walk freely among the crowds, so even muggles don elaborate demon and monster costumes. Families carve jack-o'-lanterns, children play tricks, and everyone tries their hand at bobbing for apples. In the non-magical world, Halloween ranks among the liveliest celebrations of the year. Take Yorkshire, where Sherlock had originally planned to attend school. Its Halloween festivities are famous throughout Britain. Sherlock had assumed the wizarding community would dismiss a Muggle festival as trivial. How wrong he was. In fact, witches and wizards observe 4 main holidays: Halloween, Christmas, Valentine's Day, and Easter. Of the 4, Valentine's Day feels the most out of place at Hogwarts, quietly acknowledged, mostly by the older students. Christmas and Easter, by contrast, come with full breaks, despite the church's historic persecution of magic users. On Halloween morning, Sherlock awoke to the rich aroma of roasted pumpkin drifting through the castle corridors. From that moment on, there was no denying the magic of the season. The final lesson before the celebration was charms, and the first-year students were abuzz with excitement. Today, they would learn the levitation charm. Professor Flitwick began the class with a demonstration featuring Neville's pet toad, Trevor. Known for his wanderlust, he was forever slipping free of Neville's grasp. Trevor surprised everyone when, at Flitwick's precise Wingardium Leviosa, he veered smoothly above the desk, legs dangling comically as if he were truly flying. For a moment, the room erupted in cheers. But when the students tried it for themselves, that enthusiasm quickly sputtered out. Unlike the simple 2-syllable spells they'd mastered so far, Wingardium Leviosa stretched to 8 syllables, each one demanding perfect pronunciation, and the wand movement had to be absolutely precise. What had sounded so elegant in theory now felt impossibly complex, and frustration rippled through the room. As always, the practical portion was done in pairs. Harry was thrilled when Sherlock agreed to partner with him. Seamus Finnegan, who'd been angling to work with Harry, looked disappointed, but soon turned to Neville instead. Harry didn't mean to slight Seamus. He simply felt more confident practicing this tricky charm with Neville, whose steady pace made him a reassuring choice. Side by side, Harry and Sherlock raised their wands and prepared to give Wingardium Leviosa another try. The celebration, and a much-needed victory over this challenging spell, felt just within reach. In both Transfiguration and Charms classes, the same thing kept happening. Spells that worked perfectly for everyone else blew up in his hand. Whether it was a simple levitation charm or a basic transformation, his wand inexplicably turned them into miniature fireworks. Sherlock Holmes, ever the scientist, set out to solve the mystery. His analysis led him to suspect a hereditary link. He first tested his theory on Seamus Finnegan one crisp September morning at platform 9-4, just before the Hogwarts Express departed. With the precision of a detective, Sherlock noted Seamus's background. A new half-blood student whose mother was a witch and whose father, a muggle, worked in demolition. A man who had only learned his wife's magical identity after they married. Sure enough, once term began, Seamus's knack for accidental explosions confirmed Sherlock's hypothesis. That left only a handful of people at Hogwarts equipped to handle the problem. Apart from Professor Flitwick, who, with great patience, managed to contain most of the blasts, only students with Sherlock's analytical skill could anticipate and counteract the runaway magic. Harry, brave though he was, had neither the scientific mind nor the subtlety of touch. Neville Longbottom, unfortunate enough to be paired with Seamus, could only swallow hard and hope for the best before every lesson. Reactions among the students ranged from delighted relief to quiet frustration. Harry was thrilled. Partnered with Sherlock, his own spells would be safer, his classes far less hazardous. Hermione, on the other hand, was disappointed. She had long hoped to work alongside Sherlock's brilliant mind. Instead, she found herself stuck with Ron Weasley, whose cold indifference toward her had been evident since the very start of term. Earlier, Hermione's bold defense of Sherlock and Harry had temporarily restored Ron's faith in her. But almost as quickly as that goodwill appeared, her subsequent behavior sent it crashing down. First, she'd scolded them for refusing to stand up to Malfoy, then she'd lurked in the corridors well past curfew, ready to report every misstep. Even Sherlock's discreet advice on smoothing things over failed to turn the tide. These days, apart from Sherlock himself and shy Neville Longbottom, only Harry would exchange more than a curt nod with Hermione, and Harry did it purely out of loyalty to Sherlock. Neville, gentle and reserved, offered polite conversation but little more. In truth, the only person who seemed completely unfazed by the growing chill from the rest of Gryffindor was Sherlock. Ironically, Flitwick had never seen fit to pair them together in class. Clearly, observation wasn't his strongest suit. "Wingardium Leviosa," Ron roared, his wand spinning in a wide, wild arc. Each exaggerated flick carried a measure of his frustration at Hermione's icy reception. He fixed his glare on the feather hovering at his desk, willing it to rise, and in doing so, to feel the strength of his resolve. He recalled Harry's words about the flying lesson. A broomstick reveals your hidden doubts. To ride with confidence, you first have to banish your fear. With that determined thought, Ron steadied his wrist, and the feather lifted gracefully into the air. Ron's attempt at Wingardium Leviosa was more roar than charm, and he sounded less confident than menacing. Unsurprisingly, the feather sat stubbornly on the desk. Hermione sighed. "It's Wingardium Leviosa. You have to stress the gar and draw out the last syllable." Ron bristled at her correction, ready to snap back, but Hermione simply raised her wand and spoke in a crisp London accent. "Wingardium Leviosa." The feather shivered, lifted gently, and hovered above the desk. Hermione allowed herself a small, triumphant smile. "Splendid," Professor Flitwick exclaimed, clapping his hands. "Miss Granger has done it. 1 point for Gryffindor." He added 2, since Sherlock Holmes had already mastered the levitation charm a few moments earlier. Emboldened by Sherlock's success, Harry had also succeeded after a couple more tries, earning Gryffindor yet another point. But it was Sherlock's demonstration that had drawn genuine applause from their classmates. Harry's achievements drew thunderous applause, easily drowning out the polite claps Sherlock received whenever he scored points. Such was the prestige of the chosen one in the wizarding world. Only Hermione seemed to notice the imbalance, but no one else gave her a second glance. It was the last charms class before Halloween, and the hour was winding down. Earlier, Sherlock and Harry had each demonstrated their spells with perfect precision, earning valuable points for Gryffindor. Hermione was next. She raised her wand, pronounced the incantation crisply, and watched her charm succeed on the first try. Another point for their house. Across the room, the Ravenclaws applauded in polite solidarity. Gryffindor and Ravenclaw enjoyed a friendly rivalry, and it was customary for them to cheer each other on. But this time, their applause was tepid. Where they'd once greeted Harry's and Sherlock's victories with genuine enthusiasm, now they merely clapped out of obligation. Even some Gryffindors exchanged awkward glances, as if they, too, wondered why Hermione's success felt so routine. The sudden chill in the classroom was unmistakable. Professor Flitwick, absorbed in his lesson plan, didn't notice the shift in atmosphere. He moved straight on to the next student. Poor Ron, ever earnest but ill-suited to charms, fumbled his way through the spell until the bell rang. He never quite got it right, no surprise there, and he shrugged it off with a rueful grin. Charms might not be his strength, but today the sting of his own failure was softened only slightly by the lingering awkwardness surrounding Hermione's flawless performance. Hermione wouldn't stop pestering him as they stood in the dim corridor outside the charms classroom. She tapped her foot impatiently and leaned in, voice sharp with urgency. "Why won't you try the Featherlight charm? If you just do it properly, the feather would flutter. 10 points for Gryffindor. We could finally close the gap with Slytherin." "Enough!" Ron exploded. All his pent-up frustration burst free in a single, furious shout. "All you ever care about is points and rules. I didn't come to Hogwarts just to hear you nag." Hermione's mouth fell open in surprise. She clutched her arithmancy textbook to her chest, but the words she'd been ready to fire at Ron died on her tongue. She simply stood there, eyes wide, staring at him in stunned silence. But Ron wasn't finished. His voice trembled with anger as he hurled back the very criticisms he'd endured so many times before. "No wonder nobody can stand you," he hissed. "You're like a walking rulebook, bossy and impossible to please. I never asked for your help, and I don't care about those stupid points. Honestly, Granger, haven't you noticed? You push everyone away. You don't have a single friend." For a moment, everything was frozen. Then Hermione's grip weakened, and her book slipped from her fingers, thudding to the stone floor. Silence swallowed them both. Hermione stared down at her fallen book. Ron stared at her. Neither knew what to say next. The moment the words left Ron's mouth, Hermione's composure shattered. Tears welled in her eyes, and without a backward glance, she spun on her heel and fled. In her haste, she collided squarely with Harry, books and parchment spilling to the floor, then darted off through the throng of students, shoulders shaking. Ron stood frozen, the echo of Hermione's sobs still ringing in his ears. He hadn't expected her to take it so hard. Guilt washed over him. Harry righted himself, brushing stray pages from his robes, and watched Hermione's retreating figure until she vanished around the corridor bend. He turned to Ron. I know, you went too far." Ron squared his shoulders, voice stiff. "So what? I was only stating the truth." Harry met his friend's gaze. Ron sounded defiant, but his eyes betrayed him. They were clouded with regret. Before Harry could answer, Sherlock stooped to retrieve Hermione's discarded books. With impassive calm, he slid them into his satchel, then looked up at Ron. "Your point is valid," Sherlock said evenly. "He's right." Harry blinked in surprise. "Sherlock, you agree with him?" "Facts are facts," Sherlock replied, as though no one could dispute it. Harry exhaled, relief and exasperation mingling in his shoulders. Of course Sherlock would be blunt, and, in this case, correct. He shook his head and offered Ron a sympathetic half-smile. "All right, let's go find her and apologize." Ron's posture softened immediately. "Yes, you're right." Together, Harry and Ron hurried down the corridor, intent on making things right, and hoping Hermione would find it in her heart to forgive them both. Ron sagged with relief when Sherlock vouched for him. Then, as if on an afterthought, Sherlock added, "But I think you should go apologize to her later." Both Harry and Ron stared in astonishment. Ron's face twisted with confusion. "Wait, why? You just said I was telling the truth." Sherlock fixed Ron with a steady gaze. "I can tell you're nervous right now." Under that unblinking stare, Ron's eyes darted away, and his cheeks warmed. Harry, watching closely, knew Sherlock was about to sway Ron completely. After a brief pause, Sherlock went on. If your conscience were clear, you wouldn't feel the need to say you're sorry, but you do. Ron bit his lip. Not everyone can just brush things off the way you do, he muttered. He found himself more convinced than ever that Sherlock wasn't an ordinary 11-year-old. Even Percy, his prefect brother, didn't carry himself with such poise. Without another word, Sherlock had quietly turned Ron's thoughts around. Yet Hermione was nowhere to be found. She hadn't returned to Charm's class, and she hadn't been seen all afternoon. Concern flickered across Harry's face as he and Ron exchanged worried glances. What had become of her? Ron stood at the entrance to the Great Hall, frozen. He wanted to ask someone, anyone, what had happened with Hermione, but he couldn't bring himself to speak up. After all, a fair number of people had seen him rebuking her just hours before. Better to keep quiet than admit he'd been harsh, he told himself. He slipped inside for the Halloween feast, but the usual splendor of floating jack-o'-lanterns and cobweb-draped columns barely registered. It wasn't until he overheard Parvati Patil leaning across the table to confide in a friend that his heart sank. Hermione's in the girls' bathroom, crying her eyes out. She won't even let anyone comfort her. Ron's cheeks burned. He felt responsible and awful. Yet when the platters of roast beef, pumpkin pasties, and treacle tarts arrived, his stomach reminded him that food waited for no boy in anguish. He told himself that a good meal might steady his nerves first. Then he'd track down Hermione and bring her something to eat. By the time Ron had piled his plate high and begun devouring roast potatoes as though he'd never eaten, Hermione was all but forgotten. The robust flavors, the festive chatter, the laughter echoing off the enchanted ceiling, all demanded his full attention. It was halfway through the meal, just as Ron was unwrapping a particularly gooey treacle tart, that Professor Quirrell came hurtling into the hall. His robe snagged on a nearby bench, his turban askew, and one glove dangling from the sleeve of his outstretched arm. In his haste, he knocked a candlestick to the floor, sending sparks skittering across the flagstones. Heads turned. The hall fell into a hushed murmur. Ron stopped chewing. Whatever news Quirrell bore, it was bound to eclipse even a broken friendship. Professor Quirrell's face was pale with terror, and his famously oversized turban had slipped askew on his head. His wild entrance drew every eye in the great hall. Stumbling toward Professor Dumbledore's side, Quirrell pressed a shaking hand against his chest, as though to steady himself. Forgetting all decorum, he blurted out, "Troll! A troll's loose in the dungeons. I thought you knew." Before he could finish, he pitched forward and collapsed in a dead faint. A stunned silence rippled across the hall. The teachers, who had been bracing to scold him for interrupting, looked helplessly at one another. Students whispered and edged closer to their neighbors, eyes wide with fear. At last, Professor Dumbledore raised his wand and sent a cluster of soft purple fireworks cascading above the long tables. The booms and sparks drew everyone's attention up to the enchanted ceiling and bought a moment of calm. "Prefects," Dumbledore called out in a clear, steady voice, "please lead your house members back to their dormitories at once." Percy Weasley, who had been sitting at the Gryffindor table, rose promptly and straightened his prefect's badge. "Right away, Professor," he said crisply, and immediately began organizing his fellow Gryffindors toward the exit. Slowly, under the prefect's calm guidance, the great hall emptied. Even as students hurried past one another in the torchlit corridors, their thoughts all revolved around the same alarming question. Where was that troll now? "Attention, upperclassmen, please clear the way and let the first years go first. I'm a prefect." Chapter 48. Sherlock Walks Alone. Amid the chaos of the corridors, Harry and Ron stuck close to Percy, who, despite his endless complaints, had an uncanny ability to look after his younger brothers when it mattered most. "Don't worry," Percy barked, elbowing aside a pair of students. "As long as you follow my instructions, you've nothing to fear from a troll. Now, stay right behind me. Move out of the way. I'm a prefect." His prefect badge did grant him some authority, but as they tried to force their way back to Gryffindor Tower, a crush of Hufflepuff students blocked their path. Percy's determined strides carried him ahead, but Harry and Ron found themselves struggling to keep up. Ron's face twisted with frustration. Just as Ron was about to surge forward again, Harry yanked him back. Years spent alongside Sherlock had sharpened Harry's instincts for spotting danger and acting on it. Pulling Ron aside, Harry's voice dropped to a tense whisper. "Wait, I just remembered Granger." Ron blinked, clearly puzzled. "Granger? What about her?" Harry asked, locking eyes with Ron. "She doesn't know about the troll yet." Ron went pale. "Damn it, Sherlock." Their first instinct, whenever they hit an impossible problem, was always to call on Sherlock Holmes. But now, Sherlock was nowhere to be found. "Sherlock! Sherlock, where are you?" Ron shouted, spinning in a circle. There was no answer. At this critical moment, Sherlock had simply disappeared. Harry's brain clicked into place. He hadn't seen Sherlock since Quirrell showed up. No wonder he'd felt like something was missing. And Sherlock certainly wasn't trailing along behind Percy and the other Gryffindor first years. "He must have gone off to find Granger by himself," Ron said with exasperation. Harry nodded. After all, very few people on campus ever earned Sherlock's direct attention. More often than not, he didn't even bother to learn surnames. Why clutter his mental hard drive with what he considered useless information? Harry and Ron exchanged a nervous, excited glance as they prepared to go it alone. Sherlock wasn't with them this time. True to their Gryffindor hearts, they were more than ready for action. "So, you think we should do this?" Harry whispered. "Absolutely. Let's go. Let's go," Ron urged, bouncing on the balls of his feet. "Quiet," Harry hissed, looking around. "Don't let Percy spot us." "I still can't believe Sherlock bailed," Ron muttered. "Afraid we'll slow him down?" They hunched their shoulders and slipped into the throng of passing Hufflepuffs, trading grumbles as they re-emerged into a deserted side corridor. Their footsteps quickened when they reached the entrance to the dungeons. Almost at once, a vile stench hit them. Imagine Ron's unwashed socks left to fester for weeks in a grimy public lavatory, then tossed in a few surprise flavors from Bertie Bott's every flavor beans. Their noses wrinkled, and they clamped their hands over their mouths, refusing even to inhale lest they faint or vomit. Cautiously, they peered around the corner and froze. The sight that met their eyes stopped them cold. When Professor Quirrell swept into the Great Hall to announce the troll in the dungeons, Sherlock's brow furrowed. He knew at once that the situation was far from simple. He owed this insight to Professor McGonagall. To honor a promise he'd made her, Sherlock had sat in on Quirrell's defense against the dark arts lessons for the past 2 weeks, and in that time, he'd learned more than anyone realized. From the moment he first heard Quirrell's tale of a sudden personality shift after encountering a vampire, Sherlock's instincts had screamed fabrication. Even Harry had harbored doubts, but with so little to go on back then, Sherlock hadn't pursued them. Now, though, he was present day after day. Quirrell's every word and gesture passed under Sherlock's unwavering gaze. Something about the man didn't add up. In the Muggle world, Sherlock Holmes would have launched an immediate investigation. This was the magical realm, however, and Professor Quirrell, Dub, Ios as he appeared, was still an adult wizard. If Sherlock's suspicions bore any truth, Quirrell's powers might be formidable. Acting on impulse would be outright foolish. Sherlock straightened his shoulders. He would keep watch, collect evidence, and, if necessary, unravel the truth behind Quirrell's strange tale. There was bravery, after all, in applying reason before rushing headlong into danger. Sherlock's first impulse sprang from the same habit that drove him through every case. Time was always against him. At Hogwarts, every professor harbored secrets, and Professor Quirrell, though odd, had shown no immediate danger. Sherlock had mentally shelved his suspicions until today. The instant Quirrell staggered into his path, Sherlock spent less than a second deducing cause and effect. Without hesitation, he sprang into action. If he moved swiftly enough, he could unravel Quirrell's plot and rescue Hermione at the same time. Everything played out exactly as he'd predicted. He reached the dungeons mere seconds before the troll did. That slight advantage, no more than half a minute, proved crucial. He burst into the girls' lavatory just in time to drag Hermione to safety before the monstrous troll could trap her inside. Drag was the only word for it. Hermione was in no condition to run. Her limbs were heavy, her body limp. She could barely form words. She stumbled forward purely on Sherlock's strength, his firm grip on her arm preventing her from collapsing. It was perfectly understandable. Though Hermione possessed a will of iron, she was still an 11-year-old girl who'd spent most of the day sobbing alone in a locked restroom. She was hungry, exhausted, and utterly terrified. Confronted at last by a hulking troll, her frightened mind had gone blank. Yet now, with Sherlock's steady presence, she clung to the hope that everything would and must be all right. Seeing an illustration of a troll in a book and coming face to face with one in real life are two entirely different experiences. The creature standing before them was easily 12 feet tall, head and shoulders above even Hagrid, the half-giant. And while Hagrid's size was intimidating, he still looked human. This was something else entirely. At first glance, the troll's body appeared to be hewn from massive boulders piled one on top of another. Its skin was the dull gray of granite, streaked with dried leaves and clumps of mud that clung stubbornly to its joints. The legs were short and thick, like the stumps of ancient trees, while its arms swung down past its knees, each one ending in a huge knotted hand that gripped a crude wooden club, almost as tall as the troll itself. Its head was disproportionately small, sunk into a thick neck so that the creature's features were nearly lost in shadow unless you squinted. But what struck them most was the stench, a pungent, earthy odor that invaded their nostrils and seemed determined to settle in their lungs. In a video game, a troll this grotesque might be almost funny. In real life, though, it was the embodiment of pure terror. For an 11-year-old girl, witch or not, coming face to face with a living troll was enough to freeze anyone in their tracks. And in that moment, neither Lily nor her friends could move a muscle. Sherlock's mental resilience was already exceptional, and having steeled himself in advance, he remained remarkably calm in that moment. Chapter 49. Attack of the Giants. The instant Sherlock caught sight of the creature, a flood of information surged into his mind. Trolls, he knew, originated in Scandinavia, but had since spread throughout Britain, Ireland, and other northern regions. Though they preferred raw meat, they were far from picky. Prey ranged from wild animals to unwary travelers, with fish holding a particular appeal. Trolls were notoriously brutal, prone to unprovoked violence and relentless attacks. Scholars and survival experts commonly divide trolls into three categories based on habitat and appearance: mountain trolls, forest trolls, and river trolls. Of these, mountain trolls were by far the largest and most dangerous. Sherlock recalled the details from two sources. The first, Fantastic Beasts and Where to Find Them, was a standard first-year textbook, heavy on theory and natural history. The second, The Handbook for Survival in Desperate Situations, was a no-frills guide filled with hard-won lessons and practical advice. Both volumes had sounded similar warnings, but now, standing before him and Hermione, the monster towering over them was unmistakably a mountain troll, the very apex predator of trollkind. People come in all shapes and sizes, the author had written. I once, in a fit of rage, felled a mountain troll with nothing but a single longsword strike. Don't let that fool you. Troll meat is almost devoid of protein, barely 1/6 that of beef, and even after gutting the head, it's hardly worth eating. My advice, never challenge one of these beasts unless you're a powerful wizard or boast a physique like mine. After confronting this hulking creature in the castle corridor, Sherlock couldn't agree more. Without a word, he clamped a hand over Hermione's mouth and tugged her out of the girls' restroom. Under normal circumstances, she would have fought him every step of the way, but today she was spent, her energy sapped by hunger and fear. Her tears had long since dried on her cheeks, and she followed him weakly, unable to muster the strength to protest. Behind them, the troll paused at a wooden door, its dull yellow eyes pressing against the crack. It loomed there in silence, its heavy breathing rattling the hinges. After what felt like an eternity, the creature's small, lumpy head gave a subtle nod, an almost comical gesture from such a monstrous form, and it lumbered on, apparently deciding to search elsewhere. Sherlock and Hermione slipped down the empty hallway, their footsteps echoing against the stone walls. For now, at least, the troll had moved on. But neither of them felt safe yet. Under Sherlock and Hermione's watchful eyes, the troll that had burst into the basement finally paused, then lumbered away, its flat, coarse feet thudding heavily against the stone floor. Clumsy actor, Sherlock murmured, eyes fixed on the creature's retreating back, but far smarter than I'd have guessed. Hermione blinked, emerging from her shock. She gently pried Sherlock's hand from her mouth, sat up, and smoothed her robes. "What did you say?" she asked, her voice still shaky. "There's someone else here." Sherlock didn't reply. Instead, he pointed down the corridor, then tugged Hermione back into the shadows behind the ruined doorway. Until that moment, her nerves had been so on edge she hadn't even noticed his hand on her lips, but now, pressed against the cold stone, her heart began to pound anew. A dark figure appeared at the far end of the passage. Hermione's breath caught. Professor Severus Snape, potions master and head of Slytherin, strode toward them, his robes billowing. He paused as if sensing their presence, then continued without a word and vanished around the corner. "Professor Snape?" Hermione whispered, confusion evident in her tone. "Why is he here, alone? Shouldn't everyone be down in the Great Hall celebrating Halloween?" Hermione asked, brushing a strand of hair from her forehead. "And Sherlock, why did you come all this way to find me?" Now that her senses had snapped back into place, Hermione's brilliant mind urged with questions. Sherlock held up a hand to forestall her interrogation. "We'll talk about all that in a moment," he said, his gaze drifting to the side. "First, let's call those two." Hermione frowned. "What do you mean?" Sherlock turned to her with a hint of a grin. "If you'd been paying attention, you'd know we aren't alone." Curious, Hermione followed his line of sight and almost jumped out of her skin. Behind a massive stone griffin stood two familiar heads peeking out furtively. Ron Weasley, who had nearly gotten her trapped here, and beside him, Harry Potter. The two of them stared at the troll's towering form, eyes wide with terror, barely daring to breathe lest they attract its notice. Harry and Ron crouched behind a griffin statue in the dimly lit dungeon corridor, barely daring to breathe. The troll's heavy footsteps had finally receded, leaving only the drip of distant water and their own thundering pulses. Harry peered around the statue's stone mane and froze. "Snape?" he hissed. "Where's he going? Shouldn't he be up with the other professors?" Ron shrugged, eyes still straining for a glimpse. "I don't know, but he's heading toward the stairwell. And look, he's going up to the 4th floor." Harry's heart clenched. The 4th floor was forbidden territory, especially after Dumbledore's stern warning. He swallowed hard, and Ron raised a finger as if to say, "Just a moment, I have something to ask you about." "Don't trouble yourselves with him," a calm voice cut in from the shadows. Harry's eyes shot to the hallway entrance. Relief washed over him. "Sherlock," he cried. In an instant, the tension drained away. Sherlock Holmes, alive and keen-eyed, stepped into view. Beside him stood Hermione, her robes dusted with chalk and stone. Ron's jaw dropped. "Hermione, you all right?" She offered them a small, wry smile. "Never better, but we could use your help, fast. The trolls moved on, but there are still dangers lurking in these corridors." Harry slid out from behind the statue, Ron right on his heels. "Lead the way," Harry said, voice firm. "We'll stick together. No more surprises." Sherlock raised an eyebrow, then beckoned them forward. "Good, then let's be off. There's much to do before midnight strikes again." Together, the four of them slipped down the torchlit passage, a united front against whatever the castle held in store. Ron let out a long, relieved sigh. "Sherlock, you actually came to save her." Seeing Hermione standing unharmed at Sherlock's side, Ron was suddenly struck by a pang of guilt and an equally surprising thought. If only I'd been the one to rescue her. He shook his head, embarrassed by his own mind. No, her safety was all that mattered. After all, it was his mistake that had put her in danger. Of course he felt the urge to be her hero. Sherlock simply nodded. "Something like that. I also wanted to test a deduction of mine." "A deduction? Oh, so you were the one who spotted the troll earlier?" "Exactly." Sherlock's eyes drifted toward the dark corridor ahead, his expression sharpening. Then he turned back to Harry and Ron. "I intend to continue tracking it. Care to join me?" "Let's go. Absolutely." Ron and Harry exchanged excited grins. Now that Hermione was safe, their thirst for adventure was back in full force. Chasing down a creature as fearsome as a troll? It was exactly the kind of thrill they lived for. Hermione, however, frowned at Sherlock's choice of words. "It? You weren't referring to the troll?" Only she seemed to catch the subtle shift in his pronoun, and the implication that there might be more to this pursuit than they yet understood. Hermione's eyes lit up as she pointed to a shadowed nook in the stone wall. "There!" It's the troll's blind spot. Sherlock offered her a rare, approving smile. Exactly. Well done, Hermione. Harry and Ron finally registered what she'd discovered. Harry frowned. Wait, weren't we following Snape? No, Sherlock replied, shaking his head. We've been on the troll's trail all along. Ron's mouth fell open. Hermione's hand flew to her chest. They all stared at Sherlock, wide-eyed. Don't give me that look, Sherlock said coolly. If my reasoning holds, the real danger lies just beyond that corner. Are you coming? Hermione squared her shoulders, determination blazing in her eyes. Ron swiped his sleeve across his brow. Harry drew in a steadying breath. Absolutely, they said in unison. Despite the strangeness of Sherlock's confidence and the risk that surely lay ahead, the three friends didn't hesitate. Side by side, they slipped into the darkness, ready for whatever awaited them. Chapter 50, A Study in Scarlet. Tracking the mountain troll wasn't hard. You simply followed the foul stench. The trick, of course, was keeping your distance. Even with 4 of us, a direct confrontation with a full-grown mountain troll would have been madness. Luckily, trolls aren't particularly nimble. They're big, clumsy brutes with more muscle than brains. Sherlock led the way up the narrow stone stairs from the dank basement into a dimly lit corridor. Every few steps, the troll's grunting growl drifted ahead of us, mingled with the stench of rotting meat. I glanced at Lestrade and Martha, our reluctant but determined companions, and saw the same mixture of curiosity and dread on their faces. After several turns through the twisty passages, the troll's massive silhouette reappeared at the far end of the hallway, illuminated by the flicker of a single torch. Just as we were about to close the gap, Sherlock came to an abrupt halt. Sherlock? I asked, halting as well. What is it? He raised a finger, eyes narrowed. Here. But the troll's over there, Martha said, pointing down the corridor. Sherlock shook his head and proceeded to stride in the exact opposite direction, away from our quarry. Lestrade barked out, Hang on! Why are we? Oh, for heaven's sake, Sherlock muttered. He veered another corner and was almost out of sight before any of us could catch up. We exchanged bewildered looks. It was one thing for Sherlock to choose this monster over Snape as our priority. Odd, but he had his reasons. It was another thing entirely for him to abandon the chase mid-pursuit. Finally, unable to stand it, we sprinted after him, rounding the corner just in time to see Sherlock pause beside a cracked stone pillar, a faint smile playing across his lips. Trust me, he said, almost giddy. This way, please. We were more than ready for an explanation. As soon as they rounded the corner behind Sherlock, the 3 of them stopped dead. Ron's face went pale and he blurted out, Bloody hell! The once pristine floor had been defiled by 5 enormous letters scrawled in blood. The savage contrast was even more shocking than the sight of Hogwarts' towering spires. For a moment, then Hermione, steeled by her recent encounter with the troll, stepped forward and carefully read aloud, R-A-C-H-E, Roch? Everyone but Sherlock exchanged horrified glances. A message written in blood was beyond disturbing. Finally, Harry swallowed and whispered, What does it mean? Ron rubbed his nose. How should I know? Rachel, could be Rachel, I suppose? Hermione bit her lip. Maybe they meant to write Rachel but got interrupted before they finished. Harry's eyes narrowed. So you're saying it's a name? But the blood-stained letters offered no answer, only a silent crimson puzzle. Her name is Rachel? Hermione asked, her voice uncertain. She glanced at Sherlock, hoping for confirmation. Harry and Ron did the same, only to find that Sherlock was already at work. He'd produced a tape measure and a round magnifying glass from somewhere, and was methodically circling the blood-smeared letters on the floor. He stood, knelt, even lay flat on the ground, completely oblivious to the grim surroundings. Several times the trio opened their mouths to speak, but Sherlock's total focus gave them pause. After about 5 minutes, he crouched down and studied each letter through his magnifying glass. When he finally straightened up, he looked satisfied and slipped both tools into a large, specially sewn pocket on the outside of his robe. Thanks for staying quiet, he said, turning to smile at them. It let me get what I needed before they showed up. Some people say that genius is really just the capacity to endure endless hardship. Personally, I think that's a narrow definition, though it does suit the work of an investigator rather well. Who are they? One of the 3 blurted out. What do you want? Another demanded. And what did you find? a third chimed in. They all spoke at once, each question spinning off in a different direction. Sherlock Holmes let his gaze drift past them, toward the far end of the corridor. If I answer any of you now, you'll interrupt me before I've finished. Let's hold off for a moment. The three exchanged puzzled looks. Before any of them could voice their confusion, a thunder of approaching footsteps rolled down the marble hall. In the next instant, Professor McGonagall came into view, racing forward, closely followed by Professor Snape, and bringing up the rear, Professor Quirrell. Quirrell's eyes fell upon the huge crimson letters scrawled across the stone wall. He gave a strangled cry, dropped to his knees, clutched his chest, and began to sob uncontrollably. Snape recoiled in disgust, stepping away from his colleague as though the very sight of him were contagion. Then, his dark eyes flicked over to Harry Potter. "Potter!" he hissed. Sherlock held up a hand, as if to forestall further outbursts. "Not yet," he said quietly. "There's more to see. What kind of trick are you playing at?" Professor McGonagall didn't leap to Harry's defense this time. Instead, her gaze fixed coldly on Sherlock Holmes. "Mr. Holmes," she said, voice barely above a hiss, "I expect an explanation." Sherlock, clearly the ringmaster in this little drama, merely smiled. Facing McGonagall's barely restrained fury, he inclined his head. "An explanation?" he drawled. "Isn't it obvious?" Harry, Hermione, and Ron exchanged wide-eyed glances. Snape, leaning back against a desk with a smirk, clapped slowly. "How perfectly fitting," he purred. "The illustrious Gryffindor, so proud, and yet he can't even deign to answer his dean." McGonagall's lips thinned to a pale line. Her entire posture was rigid with fury. "I will not ask again," she warned. "Why were you not in your dormitory last night?" Sherlock sighed, as if the question were a terrible imposition. "Truly," he muttered, "it was quite evident what had happened." Placing his hands behind his back, he waited, perfectly confident that everyone else would arrive at the same conclusion without a word from him. Unfortunately, things quickly got out of hand, so all I could do was explain calmly. At the Halloween feast, I noticed Hermione was missing. Earlier that morning, Ron had upset her, and from what I gleaned talking to other students, she'd retreated to the girls' lavatory alone. Then, when Professor Quirrell announced that a mountain troll was loose in the dungeons, I realized how dangerous her situation must be. I seized the first opportunity and hurried down to the underground classroom to find her. Ron shot Harry an incredulous look, one raised eyebrow silently taunting. "See? He's just worried we'll slow him down." Sherlock went on. "Luckily, I reached Hermione before the troll did." Almost at the same moment, Harry and Ron arrived, clearly with the same idea. But our combined magic was no match for such a creature, so we slipped away through the back passages. And that's how we ended up here. "Exactly," Hermione said, stepping forward to confirm every word. "That's precisely how it happened." Professor McGonagall's stern frown softened just a fraction, but she still refused to look at Harry and Ron. She considered their account utterly worthless. "And you call this obvious?" she asked, her tone frosty. Before she could demand further explanation, Professor Snape cut in, his voice as cold as ever. "Mr. Holmes, or do you expect us professors to divine your activities by mere guesswork?" Snape's sarcasm hung in the air. Holmes turned to him with quiet confidence. "Isn't that the very point of observation?" Snape bristled, about to fire back, when Holmes continued, his words rapid and precise. "For instance, I can tell you've just fought a troll, and won, and immediately before that, you tried to pass through a corridor, guarded by a massive dog, which bit your right leg." At that, Snape's expression darkened further, more severe even than McGonagall's had been moments before. Professor Snape's voice cut through the chatter like a blade. "That's enough. Put away your tiresome muggle parlor tricks." Hearing Sherlock's attempted deduction, the potions master snapped his black gaze from Harry to the detective. "Holmes, just who do you think you are? You imagine you can determine what happened here after a few glances? Do you really see yourself as some famous sleuth from a novel?" "It's a deduction, not a guess," Sherlock replied coolly. Snape's chill aura filled the room, but Sherlock didn't flinch. He inclined his head slightly. "If you like, I can offer an interpretation that might shed some light on your case." Snape scoffed. "Silence, Holmes. I have no use for your tedious analyses. What I need to tell you is simple." He let the words hang in the air before delivering his judgment with a sneer. 20 points from Gryffindor. Even with Gryffindor's dean standing at his side, Snape showed no hesitation. At once, Hermione's face went ashen, and Harry's and Ron's expressions weren't far behind. Only Sherlock remained unruffled, his eyes betraying none of the surprise flashing across the other's features. Professor McGonagall's face remained inscrutable as Professor Snape deducted points, giving no hint of approval or displeasure. Then, in a voice so calm it caught everyone off guard, she spoke. "Mr. Holmes, would you care to share your observations?" Snape snapped his head toward her. "Are you quite sure you want to listen to a first year's, pardon me, speculations? Perhaps a spot of detention would be more fitting." "Thank you, Severus," McGonagall replied coolly. She met Snape's glare without flinching. "I know exactly what I'm doing. Mr. Holmes is in my house. It's my responsibility to hear him out." She turned back to Sherlock, silently granting him the floor. "Please begin." Sherlock drew himself up. This was no random outburst. It was premeditated. Every pair of eyes in the room, 3 professors and 3 classmates, fixed on him. He didn't waver. The blood-scrawled message was left by a man under 6 feet tall, right-handed, and likely in his 40s. He's quick and cunning, but his actions were not self-motivated. He was following someone else's orders. Additionally, he apparently wielded a wand no more than 9 inches long. "Enough!" Sherlock's voice rushed out, words tumbling over one another as the gathered students leaned in, wide-eyed. A harsh, cutting voice cut through the murmurs. "That's quite enough!" Professor Severus Snape rose from his seat. Black robes swirling, he fixed Sherlock Holmes with a look of undisguised contempt. "Detective Holmes," he sneered, "spare us your tedious muggle parlor tricks. They may carry weight among your kind, but in the magical world—" His cold eyes glinted as he leaned forward. "I strongly advise you to watch your tone." Straightening with sudden deliberation, he addressed the hall. "And now, Gryffindor, 10 points. For this affront to a professor." Harry, Hermione, and Ron sat frozen. They had already lost points for wandering about at night. This second penalty felt like pure humiliation. Hermione's face burned, Ron's spoon clattered against his plate, and even Harry found himself swallowing hard. None dared meet Snape's steely gaze. They dared not press the point further. Professor Snape would only dock them more severely for insolence. After all, Snape had always been unreasonably strict. So the 3 Gryffindors turned pleading eyes to Professor McGonagall. Surely, McGonagall, fair-minded and just, and their own house head, would not stand for such a flimsy excuse to punish Sherlock Holmes. To their shock, McGonagall fixed Sherlock with a calm, disappointed look. "I am very disappointed in you," she said, her tone quiet but unmistakable. Harry's heart dropped as he and the others stared in disbelief. How could she be disappointed? From all they'd seen of Sherlock's keen powers of deduction, his performance in today's demonstration had been nothing short of extraordinary, even miraculous. Even they, accustomed to his brilliance, found some of his conclusions hard to swallow. But McGonagall, who had never witnessed Sherlock's feats before, should have kept an open mind. And yet here they were, over points being deducted for reasons none of them could fathom. It seemed, for once, that justice itself had taken pause, leaving them to wonder just how unreasonable a professor could be. Professor Quirrell, who had been leaning weakly against the marble pillar, suddenly managed a meek protest. "Professor Snape, there's no rule allowing you to deduct points like that." Harry, Ron, and Hermione all brightened at once, their expressions melting into gratitude. Even Quirrell's garlic breath, normally so pungent, seemed oddly inconsequential in that moment. Snape's dark eyes flicked to Quirrell. "My rules are the rules," he snapped without a shred of hesitation. Quirrell recoiled, eyes widening in panic. Snape pressed his advantage. "And you would do well to return to your quarters at once. Class is over for the evening." Quirrell's shoulders slumped. He had no choice but to scurry away, his feeble protests swallowed by Snape's icy authority. Harry, Ron, and Hermione exchanged uneasy glances. If even a fellow professor couldn't stand up to Snape, they certainly wouldn't dare. Only Sherlock remained impassive, his brow furrowed in thought. Professor McGonagall, who seemed entirely unaware of the skirmish, addressed the 4 of them with brisk courtesy. "If you're uninjured, you'd best be on your way back to Gryffindor Tower. The Halloween feast is already in full swing." On the walk back, Ron's indignation boiled over. Outrageous. Absolutely outrageous, he muttered, kicking at a loose cobblestone. Harry and Hermione fell silent. But Sherlock merely observed the surly redhead with mild interest as the turrets of Gryffindor came into view. Professor Snape is unbelievable. What kind of excuse was that? I'm willing to bet he just made the whole thing up on the spot, Harry exclaimed. Hermione and Ron nodded vigorously. Ever since the troll incident, any rift between the three of them had vanished, and now they had united against their common enemy. Even Hermione, who normally deferred to her professors, had no qualms joining in. To their astonishment, Sherlock leaned forward and said quietly, "Actually, I think Professor Snape is a good person." Huh? The three of them turned to him, eyes wide with disbelief. Sherlock met their stunned expressions without flinching. Well, to be precise, he's a despicably good person. Silence fell. Hermione frowned. Wait, despicably good? How does that make sense? Ron shook his head. Those two words don't really go together. Sherlock smiled slightly. True, they aren't grammatical opposites. Despicable and good aren't antonyms. But that only makes the combination more interesting. It captures the truth that someone can do terrible things and yet still be fundamentally good. Harry, Hermione, and Ron exchanged uncertain glances. On paper, the phrase sounded jarring, but perhaps, they realized, it was exactly the paradox that defined their enigmatic potions master. Ron walked beside Sherlock in uneasy silence for a few paces before clearing his throat. "Sherlock," he said at last, "why didn't you take Harry and me when you went after Hermione?" Sherlock glanced at him, expression cool and unguarded. "I worried that adding more people would slow us down," he admitted. Ron's face crumpled in a mixture of hurt and exasperation. "You're really honest." Sherlock gave a half smile. "I rarely lie, only when it's absolutely necessary." For a moment, Ron looked as if he might argue, but then he shook his head and offered a wry grin. "You know what? I appreciate that." Harry, hovering just behind them, rolled his eyes but couldn't hide a small smile. Hermione, clutching her books, gave Ron a grateful nod. The four of them resumed their steady pace through the winding corridors of Hogwarts. At last, they arrived before the grand portrait of the fat lady. The heavy oak frame loomed over them, the painting's rosy-cheeked subject peering down with polite impatience. Together they faced the portrait, ready to move forward, united, if somewhat begrudgingly, by Sherlock's unvarnished truths. Chapter 52. Sherlock Holmes. It was the eve of Halloween, and news of the troll's defeat had spread through Hogwarts like wildfire. The Gryffindor common room thronged with excited first and second years, their late feast still in full swing as they laughed and chatted, far too thrilled to think about bedtime. In the midst of that raucous crowd, no one noticed when Harry, Hermione, Ron, and their unexpected companion Sherlock Holmes quietly slipped away. Minutes later, they re-entered and melted back into the celebration as if they'd never left. Yet between the four of them, an awkward hush took hold. Facing down Snape in the corridors had given them a clear, urgent bond, a shared enemy, in a sense. Back here, safe and warm, revisiting the tension felt suddenly difficult. Sherlock, untroubled by social niceties, showed no sign of embarrassment, and Harry knew he bore no guilt. It was Hermione and Ron who carried the unspoken discomfort. At last, Hermione broke the silence. She turned first to Sherlock, her eyes warm. "Thank you," she said softly, her gratitude unmistakable. Then, offering a quick smile and nod to Harry and Ron, she fled toward her plate as though fleeing for her life. "Granger, wait," Ron called, extending his hand in a silent plea. He genuinely wanted to apologize. Unfortunately, she'd already slipped away. "It's okay," Harry said, giving Ron's shoulder a reassuring pat. "I don't think she'll mind." Ron glanced after Hermione as she melted into the crowd of girls, then let out a helpless sigh and dropped his hand. People can try to teach each other all they like, but it's real experiences that leave a mark. Ever since that night, Hermione Granger had loosened up about bending school rules. It made her more approachable, and she fit in much more naturally with her classmates. Best of all, after their shared adventure, after Sherlock, Harry and Ron had earned the privilege of calling her simply Hermione. 3 days after Halloween, on the eve of Hogwarts' first Quidditch match of the season, Harry was halfway through his training when Professor McGonagall summoned him. He assumed she wanted to give him one last pep talk. After all, a victory against Slytherin would catapult Gryffindor into second place in the House Cup standings. But as he followed her across the grounds, her silence set off alarm bells in his mind. Instead of heading toward the Quidditch pitch, she was leading him into a discreet, turreted tower off to one side. Harry's heart thudded in his chest. This didn't feel like a pre-match speech at all. Professor McGonagall led Harry to the 8th floor and stopped in front of a stone gargoyle. She spoke a single word under her breath, the password. With a swift hop, the gargoyle slid aside, revealing a hidden spiral staircase ascending into darkness. Harry didn't dare ask what lay ahead. He simply followed her in silence. At the top of the winding steps stood a gleaming oak door, its surface unmarked except for a brass knocker shaped like a proud griffin. McGonagall lifted the knocker and let it fall with 3 firm taps. The door swung open, and Harry stepped inside. He blinked in astonishment. Before him lay a spacious, circular chamber lit by softly glowing sconces. A massive table, its legs carved to resemble bird-like claws, dominated the far end of the room. On a nearby shelf sat a familiar, battered wizard's hat, its frayed brim and patchwork exterior marking it unmistakably as the sorting hat that had placed him in Gryffindor on his first night at Hogwarts. But Harry's attention snapped to the figure seated behind the table. Beneath robes of deep purple and silver, a long white beard fell over a gleaming vest, half-moon spectacles perched on a crooked nose. The room, the table, even the sorting hat, faded into the background the moment Harry recognized the man before him. Albus Dumbledore. Harry pushed open the heavy oak door and froze. He was unmistakably in Dumbledore's office. 1,000 questions exploded in his mind. The upcoming Quidditch match was crucial, both for him and for Gryffindor House. Surely that was why Dumbledore had summoned him, right? But would the headmaster really get personally involved over a game? Had Harry broken some rule again without realizing it? He ran through the last few days in his head. Aside from that Halloween night escapade in the dungeons, an incident he was certain had been officially settled, he hadn't done anything to merit Dumbledore's direct attention. "Mr. Holmes," Dumbledore said, his pale blue eyes crinkling behind half-moon spectacles, "shall we begin?" At last Harry noticed he wasn't alone. Professor McGonagall stood by the fireplace. Her expression was severe but curious. Seated at the desk were Sherlock Holmes and Hermione Granger, both looking uncharacteristically formal. And to Harry's astonishment, Professor Snape leaned against a bookcase, arms crossed, sneering down at him with thinly veiled amusement. Harry's heart thudded. Dumbledore's invitation. "Mr. Holmes, can we begin?" hadn't been meant for him at all. It dawned on him. This meeting had been arranged by Sherlock. Every puzzling piece finally clicked into place. He swallowed hard, mustering his courage. Whatever was about to happen, he realized, it wouldn't be about Quidditch at all, but some new mystery Sherlock believed only Harry could help solve. "My dear Harry, just as you suspected," Sherlock said, meeting Harry's gaze. As always, he seemed to read Harry's thoughts before they even formed. "But to confirm my theory, I'm going to need your cooperation." Before Harry could answer, Professor Snape's cold voice cut through the tension. "Detective Holmes, they've all been brought here at your request," he said, stepping forward. "I trust you won't disappoint us." Harry's heart leapt. Of course, Sherlock had orchestrated this entire meeting, and Hermione must have been in on it too. But why? He opened his mouth to ask, only for Sherlock to turn to Hermione. "You may begin," Sherlock prompted. Hermione nodded, took a steadying breath, and began her account of the last charms class on the eve of Halloween. Harry at last heard her side of that fateful afternoon, and it fit perfectly with Sherlock's earlier deductions. She explained that Ron's teasing had grown unbearable, driving her to flee into the girls' bathroom, where she'd spent nearly half the day in tears. Then, just before the troll was released into the castle, Sherlock had found and rescued her. Together, he and Hermione had retraced Ron's steps, discovering where he'd gone and why. Finally, the two of them had regrouped with Harry and Ron at the corridor outside the trophy room. That was when all 4 of them had followed the troll's rampage, only to come upon the horrifying message scrawled in what looked like blood, an inscription in a strange, indecipherable script that sent chills down their spines. Hermione paused, her voice steady. Harry realized that every terrifying detail he'd half remembered fit into place now. Sherlock's theory about the Chamber of Secrets, the troll's involvement, it all made sense, seen through Hermione's eyes. And as he looked around at the assembled professors and detectives, Harry knew this revelation was only the beginning. Harry already knew most of the story from his own first-hand experience, but hearing Hermione describe it brought fresh insights. He leaned forward, hanging on her every word, until Sherlock abruptly interjected. "It's your turn now, Harry." Harry blinked in surprise. "Me?" Sherlock gave him a nod. With Dumbledore's encouraging smile on his side, Harry took a steadying breath and began to recount that fateful Halloween night. As he spoke, the pieces fell neatly into place. Sherlock had called both him and Hermione because each of them had witnessed separate, non-overlapping fragments of the evening's events. And Ron hadn't been summoned simply because he'd spent the whole time right beside Harry. But then there was the question of Professor Quirrell's whereabouts. Harry paused, realizing that Sherlock's question was waiting for him to ask. Before he could speak, Sherlock continued, his voice calm but gravity-laden. "First," Sherlock announced, "the troll in the dungeons was let in by Professor Quirrell." Hermione and Harry both gasped. For Harry, though, the revelation clicked into place. Of course, that was why Quirrell had never shown up in any of their accounts. Professor McGonagall and Snape exchanged raised eyebrows. Dumbledore, however, regarded Harry and Hermione with an unexpectedly gentle expression. "Harry, Hermione," he said softly, "would you mind stepping outside for a moment?" Harry and Hermione froze until Sherlock gave them a discreet nod. Reluctantly, they rose and slipped out the door. Snape sneered as the pair departed. "Headmaster," he drawled, placing extra emphasis on each title, "it seems that Potter and Granger trust Detective Holmes far more than they trust you." Dumbledore chuckled, unfazed by Snape's sarcasm. "Severus, this old fellow who's nearly ready for his final rest, can hardly compete with the vigor of youth." Snape glowered. Turning back to Sherlock, Dumbledore inclined his head. "Mr. Holmes, please continue." Chapter 53. Revenge. Sherlock Holmes sat behind the headmaster's desk, fingers steepled beneath his chin as he reviewed the scattered parchments. "First," he began, voice as steady as ever, "the blood inscription on the wall was penned by Professor Quirrell himself. Second, and more importantly, every action he took that night was carried out under someone else's direction." A hush fell over the office. Albus Dumbledore leaned forward, his eyes bright with curiosity. "On what evidence do you base this claim, Sherlock?" Holmes offered a faint smile. "As I always say, when you have eliminated the impossible, whatever remains, however improbable, must be the truth. Now, let us examine the facts of that evening." He tapped a finger against the desk. "Consider Quirrell's behavior. Despite his reputation for jitteriness, he is still the defense against the dark arts professor. A single mountain troll should not have reduced him to utter panic. Yet he managed to race from the underground classroom to the Great Hall, deliver his warning with remarkable coherence, and only then collapse. Such a calculated performance of fear and delay is far too contrived to be genuine." Dumbledore's gaze softened into a pleased smile. "Professor McGonagall once remarked on your extraordinary powers of deduction. It seems she was not overstating the case." Sherlock inclined his head. "Then we agree. Quirrell was merely a pawn. Our next task is to discover who pulled the strings." That evening, Professor McGonagall sought out Dumbledore in his office. She closed the door softly behind her and bowed her head respectfully. "Headmaster," she began, "I wanted to report on Sherlock's deductions regarding the blood-written message we found." Dumbledore looked up from his desk, interest lighting his eyes. "Go on, Minerva." McGonagall took a steadying breath. "According to Sherlock, the author of the message was a right-handed man, under 6 feet tall, likely middle-aged. His wand was approximately 9 inches long. He moved with surprising agility and cunning. What's more, he didn't act on his own initiative. He was following someone else's instructions." The headmaster steepled his fingers. "Fascinating. And how did he arrive at these conclusions?" "Some of the reasoning is straightforward," McGonagall explained. "For instance, you can estimate a person's height by measuring their stride length. The calculations themselves are simple, though Sherlock skipped the detailed arithmetic, deeming it unnecessary to spell out every step." Dumbledore nodded, encouraging her to continue. Then there's the placement of the writing, she went on. When people write on a wall or floor in a confined space, they tend to center their work. By identifying the geometric center of the room and comparing it to where the message was actually scrawled, Sherlock noticed it veered slightly to the right. That, combined with the angle of the strokes, confirmed the writer was right-handed. The headmaster leaned back in his chair, a thoughtful expression on his face. "Impressive observations," he said quietly. And before term even began, he deduced that Hogwarts must lie somewhere in the Scottish Highlands. "Precisely," McGonagall agreed. He pieced together local weather reports, topographical features mentioned in the legend, and transportation records. All signs pointed here. A pleased smile curved Dumbledore's lips. "Sherlock's methods may be unconventional, but they bear remarkable fruit. Thank you for bringing this to me, Minerva. We shall keep this profile in mind as we pursue the next lead." McGonagall inclined her head. "Of course, Headmaster. I knew you would want to know." With that, she took her leave, closing the office door quietly behind her, leaving Dumbledore to turn over in his mind the implications of such precise deductions. By combining those two observations, you can work out his height and his dominant hand. Seeing him write with a wand even lets you calculate its length. It's really child's play. McGonagall raised an eyebrow. "All right. But how did you determine he was agile and cunning?" Having witnessed Sherlock's powers of deduction, like pinpointing Hogwarts in the Scottish Highlands from nothing but a few vague clues, Professor McGonagall was more impressed than anyone, even Dumbledore or Snape. She had backed Sherlock's conclusions without hesitation that night. Sherlock met her gaze. "The moment I saw Professor Quirrell, I raced down to the dungeons. Even then, I only just caught up with Hermione before the troll struck. His speed tells us he's exceptionally quick, agile. As for cunning, well," he paused, considering his next words. "Quirrell unleashed the troll for two reasons. First, to sow enough chaos to slip away unnoticed and reach the fourth-floor corridor. I'm still piecing together what his second objective was, but whatever it is, it's clearly tied to the Chamber of Secrets." He fell silent, letting the weight of his deduction settle in the dimly lit staff room. McGonagall exchanged a look with Dumbledore. Both knew Sherlock was close to unraveling a secret more dangerous than any troll. Dumbledore stood by the tall windows of his office, the last light of dusk filtering through the panes. He turned to Sherlock Holmes with a nod. "I had Hagrid posted on the fourth-floor corridor," he said, his voice calm. "I was convinced it would be Quirrell's target, yet he never even arrived." Professor McGonagall and Dumbledore exchanged a quick look. Minerva's brow rose. "You worked that out too?" Holmes inclined his head. "Exactly, Professor, and we owe a debt of gratitude to Professor Snape." At those words, Dumbledore's eyes gleamed with approval. McGonagall looked genuinely surprised, and Snape's expression remained as inscrutable as ever. Holmes continued crisply. While everyone else was rushing off to deal with the troll, Snape slipped straight up to the fourth floor, confronted Quirrell, and was bitten in the leg for his efforts. Later that night, he even cut me off mid-explanation, no doubt fearing that, had Quirrell overheard my deductions, he would immediately suspect me of uncovering his plans. Before Holmes could say more, Snape's eyes flashed. "Holmes," he said sharply, "spare us these irrelevant flourishes." Holmes offered a faint, wry smile. He had been about to elaborate on the severity of Snape's wound, but the other man's barely concealed fury convinced him to let the point rest. "All right," Holmes relented with a graceful bow of his head. "That will be all, then." Dumbledore chuckled softly and turned the conversation to the next matter at hand. Yet even as they moved on, every Hogwarts professor present knew just how pivotal Severus Snape's intervention and his silent sacrifice had been. Earlier that evening, Professor Quirrell's primary plan had been foiled, so he settled for the next best option, joining Professors McGonagall and Snape in subduing the troll. In truth, he didn't need to help. McGonagall and Snape were more than capable, but the real point was the message in blood he'd already prepared when he released the creature. Both the casting time and the residues left at the scene leave no doubt that he was its author. Once the professors had the troll secured and returned above, Quirrell was the one who led them back downstairs to discover the bloody inscription. And when he saw it, his reaction was so exaggerated it only served to heighten our suspicions of him. I leaned forward. Then what about the word itself? Ratch? Could that be the name of whoever sent Quirrell? Sherlock shook his head. That's a very bold hypothesis. He paused, tapping his fingers on the table. My friend Hermione made the same suggestion, that whoever wrote it intended to spell Rachel, but was interrupted before finishing the final letter. Nevertheless, there's no need to chase after some Miss Rachel. Ratch is simply the German word for revenge. By my reckoning, whoever ordered Professor Quirrell to inscribe it is driven by extreme racism, hence the choice of German. So Sherlock paused and turned to Albus Dew. Dumbledore, sir, what have you uncovered? Even Severus Snape, primed with a sarcastic retort, fell silent. Every eye in the room, McGonagall's included, fixed on the headmaster. Dumbledore hesitated briefly, then offered a knowing smile. Minerva's intuition remains as keen as ever, he said, nodding toward McGonagall. And you, Mr. Holmes, are every bit as formidable as she claimed. McGonagall began, her voice edged with concern. It's quite all right, Dumbledore assured her with a gentle wave. He met Sherlock's gaze directly. In fact, I have discovered something. Sherlock's eyes gleamed. He folded his hands beneath his chin and leaned forward, anticipation sharpening his features. From the moment he received Dumbledore's summons, he had sensed that tonight would mark the start of something far larger than unmasking Quirrell. This revelation was only the beginning. What really mattered was who stood behind him, but Dumbledore didn't yet have all the facts. He needed a second opinion. Without warning, he turned to Severus Snape. Severus, would you mind stepping out for a moment? Snape's dark eyes flickered with annoyance. A reunion, then? Very well, he said, voice low and clipped. But Dumbledore, you owe me an explanation. With that, he swept from the headmaster's office, cloak trailing behind him. Dumbledore watched the door close, then sighed. Young people, he murmured. He turned to Professor McGonagall. Minerva, could you do me the same favor? McGonagall blinked in surprise and pointed at herself. Me, sir? Please, Dumbledore said, his familiar smile unfaltering. Trust me. Caught between irritation and curiosity, McGonagall could only stare at him for a long moment before quietly nodding. Chapter 54. He's still a child. Professor Snape had barely stepped out of the headmaster's office, dismissed by Dumbledore, when he noticed Harry and Hermione whispering in the hallway. His face darkened at once. What are you doing here? He demanded. Harry started, then rushed to explain. Professor, we were just... Snape cut him off with a cold laugh. Potter, I am not your babysitter. He ignored Hermione entirely, fixing Harry with a glare sharper than any blade. Why don't you engage your brain before you act? Or is that trinket on your neck merely ornamental? Harry felt those words land like curses. He opened his mouth but found himself speechless. Snape leaned in, voice low but venomous. Oh, and have your ears gone deaf as well? If you don't have the sense to leave, shall I arrange detention for you? Harry and Hermione exchanged panicked looks. Before either could respond, the corridor door swung open, and Professor McGonagall appeared, her expression even sterner than Snape's. Severus, she said coolly, I escorted Mr. Potter here. He's a Gryffindor student, and he has every right to wait. If there's going to be any disciplinary action, it'll be handled by me. Snape's eyes flicked to the doorway as Minerva McGonagall stepped out of the headmaster's office, flanked by Harry and Hermione. His surprise was palpable, but almost immediately his gaze softened, and Harry thought he spotted a brief, reluctant smile on the professor's lips. All right, Professor McGonagall, Snape said, voice low. But I still think you're giving them too much leeway. Severus, McGonagall snapped, her tone icily calm. I'm the deputy headmistress. Snape fell silent, blinking in astonishment. Without another word, McGonagall turned and led Harry and Hermione down the corridor. The students, who had intended to wait for Sherlock there, trailed after her in stunned silence, so quiet, in fact, that they might as well have been statues. At that moment, both agreed. Professor McGonagall was far more intimidating than Professor Snape. Once the trio vanished from view, Snape stood staring at the closed doors of the headmaster's office, his expression a tangle of emotions. Then, with a soft rustle of robes, he drifted away down the hallway. Sherlock noted that Professor McGonagall looked even more furious than Snape had when Dumbledore asked them both to leave the office. He turned to the headmaster. "Do we really have to wait until it's just the two of us to discuss this?" Dumbledore tapped his wand lightly on the desk, his eyes drifting to the wall of portraits behind them. "Yes," he said quietly, "but not just yet." Then, addressing the silent paintings, he asked, "If you please, excuse us for a moment." At his words, the portraits, many of which had been softly snoring, stirred grumpily. Yawning and muttering under their breaths, the painted figures peeled themselves from their frames, shuffled across the wall, and filed out through the portrait door one by one. Sherlock watched as each former head of Hogwarts took their leave, murmuring complaints about urgency and propriety. When the last frame hung empty, Dumbledore's gaze softened with nostalgia. Sherlock cocked an eyebrow. "They're all former principals of Hogwarts," he observed. "Including you?" Dumbledore paused, amusement flickering in his eyes. For a moment he seemed taken aback by the question. Then he gave Sherlock a small, knowing smile. "In time," he said, "but not for many years yet." Sherlock's gaze never wavered as he asked, "Are you saying one day you might be hanged here at Hogwarts?" Dumbledore offered a thin smile. "Perhaps, but I fervently hope that day lies far in the future." Sherlock inclined his head, accepting the answer. The silence that followed stretched so long it felt tangible, until Dumbledore spoke again, his tone suddenly grave. "I have reason to believe Professor Quirrell is already in league with Lord Voldemort." Sherlock raised an eyebrow. "So Voldemort really didn't die?" "I've long suspected as much," Dumbledore replied. He leaned back in his chair and folded his hands. "Many believe he perished 11 years ago, but a dark lord of his power, his knowledge of the dark arts, resisting death is hardly beyond him." He studied Sherlock closely. "You don't seem surprised." Sherlock let out a low whistle. "Rubus Hagrid told Harry something similar not long ago. Since I arrived, I've noticed other oddities that only deepened my doubts. But if Quirrell is compromised, why not simply expel him, eliminate the threat before it grows?" Dumbledore's eyes darkened with concern. "Ah, but it isn't that simple. He was an outstanding Ravenclaw. As headmaster, I cannot simply abandon one of my students, even if he has already graduated," Dumbledore said softly. "Since term began, I've seen him change so much, yet I can feel the turmoil he's in. Don't you agree?" Sherlock's lips curved in a faint, ironic smile. "Is that why you asked the others to leave?" Dumbledore's answer only amused him more. "Quirrell may be your student, but every witch and wizard in this castle, Harry, the first-year newcomers, all the upper years, they're all under your care as well. You're willing to stake so many lives on saving one misguided soul, someone who openly wrote of bloody revenge? Frankly, I don't think he's worth that price." Rather than retorting like Snape might, Dumbledore's voice remained gentle. "Sherlock, you truly are even more exceptional than Professor McGonagall claimed." Sherlock inclined his head. "Thank you. You mentioned that just moments ago." Even praise from the century's greatest white wizard could not sway his calm demeanor. "You are no fool," he said simply, leaving the words to hang in the dimly lit office. "What gave you the courage to keep Professor Quirrell at Hogwarts all this time?" Sherlock asked, his tone steady. Dumbledore paused, choosing his words carefully. "I'm sorry, but some things I cannot reveal just yet." "It's because of Harry, isn't it?" The headmaster blinked. "What did you say?" Sherlock's flat expression didn't change. "You've placed all your hopes on Harry, haven't you?" Dumbledore fell silent, studying the detective. There was something in Sherlock's steely gaze that stirred a distant memory, an old friend long gone. But before he could name the face at the back of his mind, Sherlock launched into a rapid-fire explanation. "Albus Percival Wulfric Brian Dumbledore. Headmaster, everyone says you're the only wizard Voldemort truly fears. Yet you've admitted that Voldemort is a Dark Lord who has conquered death itself. So tell me, how can Harry Potter, a mere child, a first-year student who's only just started learning magic, stand against the very architect of the Wizarding War? Do you really believe Harry is the chosen one who will defeat Voldemort? If so, perhaps you'd be better off trekking into the rainforests of Uganda and challenging mountain gorillas to a tug-of-war. Maybe those fierce slaps will clear the fog from your mind." Gale, there's a prodigy here who might even outshine you. Sherlock's eyes flashed. His barbed wit had always lurked just beneath the surface, waiting for an opening, but since arriving at Hogwarts, politeness had prevailed. Even Professor Snape, with his perpetual disdain for Gryffindor, had struck Sherlock as a disagreeable, yet fundamentally honorable man. Today, however, Dumbledore's proposal finally shattered his restraint. The headmaster intended to welcome Professor Quirrell into Hogwarts, despite whispers that he was in league with Lord Voldemort. To Sherlock, allowing Quirrell anywhere near the castle was tantamount to sentencing Harry to the jaws of death. He didn't object to calling in favors. He used Harry and Hermione whenever it served his investigations, and they'd never hesitated to use him in return. But Dumbledore's cavalier gambit was a different matter entirely. "Explain yourself, Albus," Sherlock demanded, voice steely. "Why risk a child's life on your experiment?" Dumbledore, taken aback by the unexpected confrontation, lowered his gaze and fell into solemn thought, the weight of Sherlock's accusation hanging heavily in the great hall. After a long silence, Dumbledore finally spoke, his voice calm but grave. "If you believe that Voldemort fears me above all others, you've given me far too much credit. He commands power I could never attain. But if I'm to hazard a guess at who might actually defeat him, it can only be Harry." At the words "only Harry," it was as if a lightning bolt had cleaved the sky, banishing every last shred of doubt in Sherlock's mind. 2 months at Hogwarts had steadily eroded his faith in magic, yet now, in an instant, every loose thread snapped together. "Harry's the only one who survived the killing curse," Sherlock said, voice racing. "His parents' sacrifice left him with that scar. Your faith rests on that mark, isn't it? Or more precisely, on the ancient protection it still bestows." He poured out the thought so swiftly that Dumbledore's expression twisted into something unreadable, part surprise, part admiration, part something deeper. That peculiar twinge of déjà vu returned, tugging at Dumbledore's memory until he stood once more in the quiet of Godric's Hollow that fateful summer night. In that moment, he realized that, in Sherlock's razor-sharp reasoning, he was witnessing an insight rivaling even that of an old trusted friend. Sherlock's eyes narrowed. "So my deduction was correct?" Dumbledore offered a gentle nod. "Indeed, my boy, you haven't been wrong." The headmaster's expression grew grave. "There's something else you need to know, the prophecy of the magical world's savior." At the word prophecy, Sherlock leaned forward. "The one who will end the Dark Lord's reign is born at the end of July into a wizarding family." He'd read something similar in the library, Hermione's discovery, but it had seemed nothing more than hearsay at the time. Dumbledore studied him for a moment. "That isn't wrong, but it isn't the whole truth." He sighed and spoke slowly, choosing each word with care. "The complete prophecy says, the boy born at the end of the 7th month to parents who have thrice defied the Dark Lord, and whom the Dark Lord will mark as his equal, will emerge to vanquish Lord Voldemort." Sherlock's mind raced as he filed away each crucial detail. "Mark him as your equal?" "Exactly." Dumbledore's smile was knowing. "You've spotted the critical detail." Sherlock leaned forward. "Neville Longbottom's birthday falls just 1 day before Harry's, so it was Voldemort himself who chose which child the prophecy would claim." Dumbledore nodded, his expression growing more solemn. "Indeed. The prophecy named 2 potential candidates, but Voldemort selected Harry." He fell silent for a moment, eyes distant with recollection. "On that fateful night, Lily Potter sacrificed herself to save her son. She invoked an ancient charm powered by the greatest magic of all, love, and paid with her life. When Voldemort unleashed the killing curse, it rebounded off Harry, destroying Voldemort's body and leaving him missing ever since. Harry alone withstood the curse, protected by the enduring magic his mother wove into his very skin." Sherlock tapped his chin thoughtfully. "And that is the foundation of your certainty?" Though he now understood every piece of the story, Sherlock's gaze remained skeptical, as if daring Dumbledore to offer more. "I think you should know that in this world, older doesn't always mean stronger," Sherlock said quietly. Dumbledore opened his mouth to reply, but Sherlock pressed on. "And don't worry, though that protective charm will eventually weaken, it won't fail for a long time. It must draw on a blood relative's power, right? Which is exactly why you insisted Harry stay with the Dursleys, They're the only family he has. The headmaster blinked, utterly speechless. Sherlock's insight exceeded every expectation. As he looked at the young detective, a single thought broke through the haze of surprise. See, Gellert, there's a genius here who just might surpass you. Memories of Harry's miraculous survival, Minerva McGonagall's urgent plea to sort him into Gryffindor, and the boy's quiet courage all swept through Dumbledore's mind. And with them came a second, startling realization. And there are two of them, Gellert. Sherlock, for all his brilliance, had no way of knowing what was passing through Dumbledore's thoughts, at least, not without more pieces of the puzzle. Dumbledore stared into the distance, as though he'd slipped back into some remote corner of memory. Sherlock frowned at the old wizard's vague expression. Aside from that, he pressed, is Harry being sent to face Voldemort because you can't destroy him outright? The question seemed to yank Dumbledore out of his reverie. He turned to Sherlock, eyes grave. I fear that even if we vanquish Voldemort, he will find some way to return, perhaps stronger than before. Sherlock folded his arms. So leaving behind your graduated students is only part of the reason. He paused, choosing his words carefully. The crucial matter is this. You need Harry to confront Voldemort in person, to see whether that protective charm will hold and how far it can go against the Dark Lord himself. Dumbledore's solemn gaze didn't waver. Sherlock leaned closer. As you said, the others are your students too, aren't they? At last a faint smile curved Dumbledore's lips. Rest assured, Harry will be all right. I am not the only one keeping an eye on him. Sherlock raised an eyebrow. Professor Snape, perhaps? A spark of amusement lit Dumbledore's eyes. I'm pleased we agree on that point. No, Sherlock countered. I find Snape decidedly more pragmatic than you. Dumbledore chuckled softly. If only Harry could think with your clarity. Sherlock shifted uncomfortably. Shall we talk about something else? Dumbledore cleared his throat, rummaged in his pocket, and produced a small, oddly shaped snack. Would you care for a cockroach cluster? Sherlock stared at it in disbelief. No, thank you. Very well, Dumbledore said, tucking it away. An awkward silence settled between them, two very different minds bound together by a shared concern for one young boy's fate. He settled into his chair, a faint smile playing on his lips. I'm glad Harry has someone like you looking out for him. Whether you tell him about Quirrell or not is your choice. Just don't let him in on our little deal. The other man leaned forward, folding his arms. Very well. Tell me then, what exactly did you place on the 4th floor? Nothing less than the Philosopher's Stone, the crucial ingredient for the elixir of life. You can imagine why Quirrell is so desperate to obtain it. He paused, arching an eyebrow. And just to be clear, there really isn't a nest of cockroaches skulking around, is there? The reply was brisk. Let's move on to the next topic. Chapter 56, A Most Decent Fellow. Honestly, you're a very decent fellow, Hermione said with a fond smile. So you spent all that time locked in the headmaster's office just discussing Harry's inheritance? They'd reconvened in the Gryffindor common room the next morning. Harry and Hermione sat in stunned silence as Sherlock recounted his meeting with Professor Dumbledore. Just then, Ron arrived, looking puzzled. Hang on, Ron said, folding his arms. You met with Dumbledore alone? Fine. But why did you send for Harry and Hermione and leave me out? Was that deliberate? Sherlock met Ron's gaze calmly. Yes, it was deliberate. Ron's eyebrows shot up. Care to explain? Sherlock leaned back. During the troll incident, your role was minimal. You chased Hermione toward the girls' bathroom, then stayed with Harry afterward. All the crucial observations came directly from Harry, which Hermione independently confirmed. Inviting you into today's discussion would have added nothing but confusion, like artificially raising the difficulty level of an otherwise straightforward investigation. It was more efficient to speak only with the witnesses whose testimony mattered. Hermione bristled. So you purposely excluded him for the sake of your efficiency? It wasn't personal, Sherlock said evenly. It was purely practical. Of course, everything has two sides. Harry stepped in, placing a hand on Ron's shoulder. He's just evaluating things the way he always does. He apologizes if it hurt your feelings, but the decision was made with facts in mind. Ron huffed, but the tension eased as he glanced between Sherlock and Harry. All right, fine. Just don't make a habit of it. Sherlock allowed himself a faint smile. Duly noted. As they resumed talking about Dumbledore's plans for Harry's inheritance, the familiar warmth of friendship settled once more over the three, and even Ron seemed willing to let bygones be bygones. The incident had taught Hermione a valuable lesson. She'd confronted her own shortcomings and, as a result, now got along far better with her classmates, no thanks to Ron, whose perpetual grumbling did little to help. Sherlock, however, paid Ron's complaints no mind. He turned instead to Harry. "Harry, you may not realize it, but the inheritance your parents left you is enormous." Harry sighed. "I know. I've already seen my vault at Gringotts." At the mention of his parents, a brief shadow crossed Harry's face. Sherlock seemed not to notice. He leaned forward, his tone earnest. "That's only a fraction of what's yours. There's much more waiting for you in the old Potter family manor." Harry's eyes widened. Sherlock continued, speaking deliberately, as if each word carried weight. "Among other assets, the Potters own the patent to a remarkably potent hair growth elixir. It's so effective that the marketing slogan proudly proclaims, 'Not a single bald witch or wizard in the magical world.' By the terms of the agreement, you should be receiving royalties on every bottle sold." Sherlock paused, raising an eyebrow. "Except nobody's paid you in 10 years. Although Professor Dumbledore has kindly offered to help, I'd still recommend handling debt collection in person," Sherlock remarked, his eyes gleaming with excitement. Harry could only stare, speechless. On one hand, Sherlock genuinely meant well, but on the other, did now really seem like the best moment for a lecture on financial etiquette? He felt both grateful and exasperated. "Come to think of it," Sherlock continued, "I don't believe I've ever met a bald wizard before, so that must be thanks to the Potter's family magic." Ron, who had been listening quietly, couldn't help but chime in. Sherlock nodded in agreement. He'd always assumed that a full head of hair was simply a natural perk of the magical world, a stark contrast to Muggles. But after Dumbledore's detailed introduction to the Potter family's far-reaching contributions, it dawned on him that it was their legacy that ensured every witch and wizard could boast a thick mane. Sherlock's admiration for the Potters deepened in an instant. Harry sat on the edge of a cushioned bench in Dumbledore's empty office, staring at the polished floorboards. Beside him, Ron nudged Sherlock, yes, Sherlock, who had just delivered the strangest warning of Harry's and the world's history. "One must understand," Sherlock said gravely, "baldness is every man's torment." He paused, fixing Harry with a steady gaze. "But suppose someone tried the Potter family's renowned hair growth elixir, and it failed. What then?" Ron frowned. "That's barely imaginable. Your family's potion has a perfect record." "In theory," Sherlock agreed, "failure is nearly impossible. In practice, if it did happen, it could spark a serious, well, let's call it a diplomatic incident." He leaned forward. "Anyone whose hair didn't sprout after using our potion would assume they'd been cheated. They might storm the Potter's door demanding answers, or worse, seek revenge." Harry's mouth dropped open. "You mean people would attack me over hair loss?" Sherlock shrugged. "You'd be a convenient target." Ron's eyebrows shot upward. "Right? No one's ever tried our hair tonic as a weapon before." Before Sherlock could elaborate, Hermione's voice floated through the open doorway. "Honestly, Dumbledore kicked us out of his office just to discuss hair loss?" She looked around at the three seated figures. "Does he have that much free time?" Harry rubbed his temples. Somehow, he didn't envy Dumbledore's busy schedule or his oddest concern yet. Harry cleared his throat. "Actually, I brought it up first." Sherlock regarded him with a faint, knowing smile. "My dear Harry, you deserve all the credit. No need to be embarrassed." Harry's cheeks colored. "Thanks." "You're awfully polite," Ron chimed in. "Not your concern," Hermione snapped, cutting him off. She turned to Sherlock, her eyes blazing. "Enough about hair-restoring draughts. What exactly happened with Professor Quirrell?" Sherlock leaned back in his chair. "Ah, so that's the question on everyone's mind." Hermione pressed on. "Yes, spill it." He steepled his fingers. "I have every reason to believe Quirrell arranged the troll attack in the dungeons and scrawled those blood-written messages. Yet." "Yet?" Ron echoed, shivering at the mention of Voldemort. Hermione's frustration boiled over. "Without proof, we can't even suggest he's working for you-know-who." Sherlock's tone remained calm. "Precisely. Deduction alone won't satisfy Professor Dumbledore. He won't act against a member of staff on mere speculation. No concrete evidence, no formal inquiry. Hermione sank into her seat. This is impossible. Voldemort's influence, even here at Hogwarts. She buried her face in her hands as Ron and Harry exchanged anxious glances. The castle's corridors felt colder somehow, haunted by the distant threat they dared not yet name aloud. Knowing that someone so dangerous is targeting Harry, how can we just stand by? Hermione's voice trembled with urgency. Having uncovered the prophecy in the library, she understood exactly why Voldemort had set his sights on Harry, better than Ron ever could. It wasn't about a failed batch of hair growth potion or any trivial mishap. Dumbledore promised he'd keep Harry safe, she added, as if that settled everything. Sherlock shook his head. He hadn't meant to lie, only to withhold the rest of the truth. Left to Dumbledore's urging, some would call it subtle coercion, Harry would barrel right into danger, hot-headed and unaware of the full stakes. Yes, under the watchful eyes of Dumbledore, Professor McGonagall, and even Snape, Harry might yet transform peril into advantage. But Sherlock bristled at the notion of treating a friend like a puppet, strings pulled under the guise of your own good. Conflict demands honest strategy, not hidden motives. That was why he had pressed Dumbledore to reveal every detail. And though Dumbledore had complied, almost Sherlock still sensed an unspoken piece of the puzzle. But secrets, he knew, never stay hidden for long. Harry studied the jagged red letters scrawled across the wall, his brow furrowed. Could that really be possible? Ron leaned closer, voice barely above a whisper. You actually think Snape's the one behind this? I've always figured Professor Quirrell wouldn't stoop to something so dark. Hermione shot Ron an uncharacteristic look of silence. Compared to Quirrell's nervous stammer, Severus Snape did seem the more likely villain, at least on the surface. Finally, she exhaled. You've got it all wrong about Snape. He isn't our enemy. Sherlock stepped forward and addressed Harry directly, his tone earnest. Believe me, despite his prickly demeanor, Snape is one of the few professors who genuinely wants to keep you safe. If you ever feel endangered, he's the person you should turn to. Harry met Sherlock's steady gaze and nodded. Over the past few days, he'd learned to trust Sherlock's judgments implicitly. Ron fell silent, realizing that once Sherlock had spoken, Harry wouldn't be swayed by anyone else. After a thoughtful pause, Ron cleared his throat. All right, but if the blood message was written in German, why aren't we considering a German mastermind? Chapter 57. Professor Snape's Secret. This puzzle is actually quite simple, Sherlock declared, leaning forward with a gleam in his eye. You were there when the letter was written, and if you'd paid closer attention, you'd have noticed that the A is rendered in a distinctly Germanic style, yet authentic German handwriting of the period would almost always use the Latin script. Conversely, the final E is executed in flowing cursive, a hallmark of British penmanship. Perhaps our forger tried too hard, or maybe he simply lacks finesse, but either way, his imitation falls apart under scrutiny. I can state with complete confidence that no German ever penned that note. Ron grinned and slapped Sherlock on the shoulder. See, I knew it was just like you said. Harry observed Sherlock's reaction with mild amusement. Over time, he'd noticed how genuinely pleased Sherlock became whenever someone sincerely praised his detective work. It was almost as if the great detective, usually so composed, blushed as readily as any young woman complimented on her looks, and only a heartfelt compliment would do. After Sherlock finished his analysis of the blood-written message, he looked over at Ron and said quietly, "There's one more thing you should know." Ron frowned. "What is it?" Sherlock locked eyes with him. "You've probably been wondering why I always insist that Severus Snape is, at heart, a good man, albeit a deeply complicated one." At that, Harry and Hermione sat bolt upright, Hermione's brows knit together. "Why do you say that?" "Because," Sherlock continued, "Professor Snape was once in love with your mother, long before your father ever came into the picture." A stunned silence fell over the trio. Ron gaped, Harry's hand tightened around his wand, Hermione's jaw simply dropped. "Harry," Sherlock said gently, "Snape's feelings for Lily Evans were genuine and unwavering." Harry's eyes went wide. "But how do you know this?" Sherlock regarded him steadily. "I have my methods. After your mother's death, that love didn't vanish. It was transferred to you." The words hung in the air like a thunderclap. Harry opened his mouth, then closed it. Hermione finally found her voice. "Did Dumbledore tell you this?" she asked, her tone half in disbelief, half in hope. Sherlock offered a slight, enigmatic smile. "I'll leave that for you to ask him." No one spoke for a long moment. Then, as the gravity of Sherlock's revelation settled over them, each of the young wizards realized that everything they thought they knew about Snape and about Harry's own past was suddenly up for reconsideration. "It's far too obvious," Sherlock objected, shaking his head. "You don't need any special scrutiny to see it." Hermione's heart quickened. He was referring to the very same clue from their first potions lesson, Victorian flower symbolism. Even though Snape cut her off halfway through his own explanation, she remembered every detail. Daffodils are members of the lily family, Lily, of course, being the name of Harry's mother. In Victorian floriography, daffodils signify, "My regret follows you to the grave." Wormwood denotes absence and bitter sorrow. And when you combine powdered asphodel root with a wormwood infusion, you brew a sleeping potion. In other words, a draught of living death, symbolizing a hellish, gloomy life. Hermione replayed Snape's question in her mind. What do you get if you add asphodel powder to a wormwood infusion? Sherlock's swift answer had been a sleeping potion, the draught of living death. Taken together, the puzzle Snape set was a hidden message. The lily has succumbed to bitter grief. My remorse haunts me to the end, and I exist now in a living hell. Sherlock looked to her, eyes gleaming. See? It's literally spelled out. Hermione exhaled, nerves settling into sharp clarity. Where others saw mere herbs and formulas, the two of them had unearthed a confession woven in flowers, and perhaps a motive she'd never have suspected otherwise. Hermione's eyes went wide the moment she grasped his meaning. "My dear Hermione," Sherlock said with a knowing smile, "I'm glad you remembered." He leaned back, folding his hands. "That's exactly why I insisted there was no need for covert observation. After all, on the very first day of potions, Professor Snape had already made his feelings abundantly clear. His barbed remarks and unmistakable hostility were all aimed at Lily Potter's son. Coupled with Harry's middling performance in class, Sherlock had seen enough to draw his conclusion. For the rest of the afternoon, Sherlock, Harry, and Hermione sat in stunned silence. The revelation was simply too explosive to ignore. Later that evening, Sherlock beckoned Harry to follow him out into the corridor. He produced a small, polished wooden box from his coat pocket and handed it to Harry. "What's this?" Harry asked, blinking at the unexpected gift. Sherlock gave him a steady look. "A present your father left for you." Harry's thoughts, still tangled with Snape, fell silent. He lifted the lid with reverence, as if expecting to find a priceless heirloom inside. His fingers paused on the edge of the box, anticipation and something deeper, shining in his eyes. A strange object rested in the center of the wooden box, neither quite solid nor liquid. It gleamed with a silvery gray sheen that caught the light like rippling metal. Harry leaned forward, curiosity warring with caution. When he slipped his fingers through the opening, he had to stifle a gasp. The liquid shivered beneath his touch, soft and fluid as water, yet threaded together like the finest silk. "It's an invisibility cloak," Sherlock said, watching Harry's fingers trace the fabric. "Professor Dumbledore asked me to give it to you, and to remind you to be careful with it." Sherlock offered a small, knowing smile. "Though, between you and me, he was reluctant. I think he's afraid you might use it for questionable ends." Harry continued to stroke the cloak, as if memorizing its every fold. His eyes were fixed on the silver threads until at last he looked up. They shone red, not with tears but with something like awe. "Why? Why would he give it to me?" His voice was soft, almost a whisper. "Why what?" Sherlock tilted his head, intrigued by Harry's sudden shift in mood. Harry drew in a steadying breath. "Why give it to me? If it weren't for you, Professor Dumbledore never would have trusted me with something so powerful." Hearing that, Sherlock's lips curved into a warm smile. He stepped closer and laid a hand on Harry's shoulder. "I'm honored that you trust me so much, Harry. You've earned this cloak. No one else could wear it with the same responsibility." Harry nodded, the weight of the moment settling over him like a cloak of its own. Carefully, he lifted the shimmering fabric from the box and folded it in his hands, determined to live up to the faith both Dumbledore and Sherlock had placed in him. "I should probably mention," Sherlock continued, That Dumbledore originally intended this as your Christmas gift. It came up when we were discussing the inheritance your parents left you, and I suggested he give it to you now. I'm pleased he agreed. That said, I think you're better off waiting until after the Quidditch match to use it. It just so happens I also plan to. Sherlock. Before he could finish, Harry threw his arms around him in a sudden, tight hug. Sorry. Harry pulled back, cheeks flushed. Sherlock, you're incredible. I don't even know how to put into words, but thank you. Meeting you has been the best thing about coming to Hogwarts. Sherlock blinked at the unexpected display, then smiled. I'm honored to receive such praise from the chosen one himself. Harry waved his hand, embarrassed. I'm not some legendary hero. You're far more impressive than I am. I've just been lucky. Luck is always a component of strength, Sherlock said quietly, and you'll need it in everything you do from here on out. Harry nodded earnestly. I'll remember that. Sherlock's lips curved into a fond smile as they prepared to head off, together. Those four mempial words conveyed absolute trust. By the way, Harry asked, curiosity lighting his eyes, what did you say you were going to do after the Quidditch match? Sherlock allowed himself a small third smile of the day. I'm going to help you level up. Chapter 58. Don't be afraid of what I'm about to say. Since early November, the weather in Scotland had grown brutally cold, nowhere more so than at Hogwarts, perched high in the Highlands. The surrounding peaks lay buried under a 10-day drift of snow, and the Black Lake had frozen over ahead of schedule, its glassy surface tempting thrill-seeking first-years to skate and tumble across it. Although the sun shone brilliantly on that Saturday morning, the air inside the castle remained sharper than ice. In the great hall, the clatter of cutlery and the rich aroma of sizzling bacon were muted beneath a tide of excited chatter. Today heralded the season's first Quidditch match, Gryffindor versus Slytherin. Steam curled from steaming mugs of cocoa as fortunes were cast and predictions volleyed back and forth. Every now and then, the conversation stilled, and curious eyes drifted toward Harry Potter. Rumor had it that Professor McGonagall had granted an unprecedented favor. Harry, the youngest first year in living memory, had been named Gryffindor's new seeker. Oliver Wood, the house captain, was livid. He had intended to unveil this secret weapon only when the match began, to catch Slytherin completely off guard. He'd guarded the plan as carefully as he did his broom, and never imagined it would leak out, just as Sherlock had foreseen. By now, Wood's hunt for the person who leaked the news had become pointless. All he could do was simmer with frustration. Meanwhile, the entire school was buzzing about Harry's impending Quidditch debut. Some insisted he'd excel, that the boy who lived couldn't possibly be bad on a broom, or he wouldn't have earned a spot on the house team so quickly and fairly. Others, however, predicted disaster. Rumor had it someone might have to run onto the pitch with a mattress to break his fall. He's just jealous you made the team as a first year, Hermione said, eyes narrowed as she stirred her porridge. Malfoy and his gang probably spread those rumors. Sherlock, leaning against the window frame, nodded coolly. No doubt. Their schemes serve only to vent spite, though I'll admit their imagination is impressive. Harry, eat something before the match. Ron grumbled around a mouthful of sausages. Harry shook his head. I'm not hungry. Hermione pushed a plate of toast toward him. Just one slice. You'll need the energy. I'm not hungry. Harry shook his head again, pressing a hand to his stomach. His nerves were fraying. He'd already made 3 trips to the loo in the past half hour, and the thought of playing Seeker in under an hour only made things worse. Eat something, Sherlock urged, his gray eyes fixed on Harry. You'll need every ounce of strength you can muster. The Seeker is always the opponent's prime target. Harry flinched, then nodded obediently. Neville stepped forward and pressed a buttered slice of toast into his hands. Hermione and Ron exchanged a look that said, You two only listen to him, don't you? But said nothing aloud. By 11 o'clock, nearly every student and teacher at Hogwarts had gathered in the stands around the Quidditch pitch. Though the bleachers were magically raised high above the ground, a surprising number of spectators still brought binoculars just to catch the finer details of the match. Sherlock led Hermione and Ron up to the very top row, where they had an unobstructed view. Their privileged seats were thanks to Wood, who'd been determined to recruit Sherlock for the Gryffindor squad. As an enticement, he'd granted Sherlock full access to the team's practices, and that inside track had seamlessly translated into VIP accommodations for today's game. Now, perched above the field, Sherlock subtly scanned the Gryffindor chasers as they warmed up below, already mentally cataloging their strengths and weaknesses. Hermione settled beside Harry, offering him a small, encouraging smile. Ron leaned forward, peering through his binoculars. Harry took a deep breath, loaded up on his toast, and allowed himself to be flustered by his friend's quiet confidence. The stands hummed with excitement as the rival teams filed onto the field. For Harry Potter, the real trial was about to begin, and this time he was ready. Neville Longbottom, Dean Thomas, and Seamus Finnegan dropped everything the moment they saw Hermione and Ron in the hallway. Wordlessly, they unfurled a sheet stolen from Sherlock's bed, one that Scabbers had christened rather spectacularly last week, and revealed a gigantic, hand-painted banner. In bold crimson letters, the slogan read, "Potter will win," and beneath it, Dean's deft strokes had brought a roaring Gryffindor lion to life. Hermione gave the banner a quick once-over, lifted her wand, and whispered an enchantment. Instantly, the letters began to shimmer with prismatic light, drawing every eye in the corridor. "Where's Sherlock?" Seamus asked, admiration in his voice. Everyone knew Sherlock Holmes was Harry's closest friend and fiercest ally. Ron, leaning against the wall and gnawing on a chicken leg, didn't even look up. He slipped off to see Harry. Something he said was urgent. "Urgent?" Dean echoed, eyebrows shooting up. "But the match is about to start." Upstairs in the changing room, Harry was already pulling on his scarlet Quidditch robes, his heart pounding with anticipation. The roar of the crowd drifted through the castle corridors. In a few moments, the Gryffindor seeker would be out on the pitch, and this enchanted banner would be cheering him on. Sherlock guided Harry into a quiet corner of the courtyard. "Harry," he said softly, "what I'm about to tell you, don't panic." Harry's heart thudded so hard he thought Sherlock might hear it. He forced a nod. "Okay. What about your broomstick?" Sherlock asked. "You mean the Nimbus 2000? Harry blinked. He couldn't imagine why Sherlock was suddenly so interested in his broom, but he answered truthfully. "It's great. I just think about the turn I want, and it follows." "Excellent," Sherlock said, but the slight tightening around his lips told Harry there was more. "If I'm right, someone's planning to interfere with it before your Quidditch match." Harry's blood ran cold. What kind of interference?" "Nothing fatal," Sherlock replied, though his tone left no room for comfort. "Someone intends to cast a jinx on your broom so that you lose control and fall." Harry stared at him, pale as a ghost. "They want me to crash?" "Precisely." Sherlock placed a steadying hand on Harry's shoulder. "But I've made sure you're not alone. Professor Snape will be watching the pitch. He'll keep an eye out for any foul play." Harry swallowed, tension knotting his stomach. He should have felt relief at Snape's protection, but instead he felt more vulnerable than ever. Sherlock gave him a firm nod. "You'll do just fine. Now go get ready." Harry forced a smile, though it threatened to crack as he hurried away, every step heavy with dread. "I'll be ready to step in and stop whoever makes a move," Sherlock promised. Harry let out a slow breath, feeling some of the tension drain away. He leaned closer, lowering his voice to a near whisper. "Quirrell?" Sherlock considered for a moment. "I can't be certain, but if anyone acts today, I'd bet on him. I even suggested Dumbledore come to watch the match. His presence would guarantee your safety. Of course, it would also warn our adversary off. He wouldn't dare make a move with the headmaster in the stands." Sherlock paused, then surprised himself by asking, "That said, it's still dangerous. Do you really want to go ahead with the match?" Harry met Sherlock's gaze. His friend's face was as composed as ever, yet for an instant, Harry saw genuine worry flicker in those cool gray eyes. Even Sherlock's calm tone held an undercurrent of concern. It dawned on Harry that Sherlock was truly anxious about him playing bait, luring a hidden serpent into the open. He'd mentioned Snape as a possible threat, but here, in that brief, protective look, Sherlock revealed a side Harry hadn't noticed before. Harry used mid-thought, a playful spark in his eye. "What if I just refused?" he wondered. "What if I say no?" Before the question even fully formed, Sherlock spoke up in his calm, assured tone. "Then I'll do it myself." A warm flush swept over Harry's cheeks. He managed a grateful smile. "Thanks, Sherlock," he whispered, his voice catching slightly. He met Sherlock's gaze, sincerity shining in his eyes. "If both you and Dumbledore need me, I'll do it." From the front of the hall, Captain Wood's booming voice cut through the moment. "Hey, Potter, Holmes, what are you waiting for? We're about to begin." Harry groaned. "He's starting without us. If we're missing one person, he'll think we've all gone soft." Before he could finish, Wood's firm hand landed on his back. "Ow! Why did you do that?" Harry protested. Nearby, Fred and George Weasley were just about to crack a wisecrack of their own, but the captain's glare silenced them in an instant. As the twins fell mute, Harry squared his shoulders. Ready or not, the show was about to begin. Chapter 59. Stay sharp. Don't lose points. Harry twisted his head at the half-joking shouts from the Weasley twins. "Just a moment. Almost ready," he called back. Sherlock, leaning in the doorway, caught the edge of tension in Harry's voice and offered him a kind smile. "My dear friend, I can tell you're nervous. Try to calm yourself." Harry's shoulders stayed stiff, so Sherlock strode over and gave him a reassuring pat on the shoulder. "You must trust in your own talent. Remember, stay alert out on the pitch and don't give up any points. And once you've shaken them off, end the match as quickly as you can." Finishing his advice, Sherlock nodded to the rest of the changing room and slipped quietly away. He'd said all he needed to say. Now it was up to Harry. When Harry returned to the Gryffindor team, Fred Weasley leaned in, curiosity dancing in his eyes. "Well, what did he tell you in there?" Every eye in the room turned to Harry. After all, no one but team members were supposed to enter the changing room before a match. Yet, here was Sherlock Holmes, giving Harry Potter a last-minute pep talk. Harry sat up straighter, a proud grin spreading across his face. "Sherlock came all the way to cheer me on," he announced, puffing out his chest. "He told me to stay sharp during the match and not give away any points." Oliver Wood nodded approvingly. "He's right. We all need to keep our wits about us. No careless fouls, no lost goals." Then Wood fixed Harry with a steady look. "And Potter, make sure you get your friend onto the house team as soon as you can." Harry blinked in surprise but managed a nod. "I'll do my best." Clearing his throat, Wood raised his voice to address everyone gathered nearby. "Lads and lasses," Chaser Angelina Johnson interjected with a pointed glance, reminding him that the girls were just as involved. Wood raised his eyebrows in acknowledgement. "Exactly. It's time." From the sidelines, Ron Weasley muttered, "This is it, the big moment." George Weasley leaned in. "The one we've been waiting for all year." Fred, ever the show-off, added loudly, "We've got Oliver's whole speech memorized. Remember, we were on the team last season." Wood's face darkened. "You two, enough." He made a theatrical swing at them. The twins, well practiced in avoiding trouble, darted aside grinning at each other. With the last of the chatter dying down, Wood raised his hand for silence. "Right, let's get moving." The team straightened up, hearts pounding, as the first whistle of the match pierced the air. Nothing to do now, but give it their all. Thanks to the Weasley twins' antics, the tension in the changing room all but vanished. Harry followed his teammates out through the tunnel and into the roaring stadium, but the moment his feet hit the grass, his knees began to tremble again. Even as Madame Hooch, standing at midfield, had crisply outlined the rules, Harry's legs felt like jelly. Then something high above the stands caught his eye. A bright banner unfurled on the wind, its letters glowing in the afternoon sun. "Potter for the win." Harry's heart leapt. His friends were here. In an instant, every trace of doubt drained away. His back felt strong, his legs steady, and energy pulsed through him. It was like magic. Madame Hooch blew her silver whistle with a sharp crack. Harry vaulted onto his Nimbus 2000, heart pounding, and heard Sherlock's voice in his mind. "Stay alert. Don't lose points." Chasing that thought, he kicked off into the sky. The other seekers were already climbing high, and the match had begun. Below him, Sherlock settled back into the stands, confident his friend was ready for whatever came next. The Quidditch match had only just begun, and with neither seeker having spotted the golden snitch yet, there wasn't much for them to do but circle the pitch. From their seats high in the stands, Sherlock Holmes, Hermione Granger, and Ron Weasley watched the game unfold. Hermione seized the moment to press Sherlock. "What did you say to Harry?" she asked, her voice low but urgent. Sherlock lowered his binoculars and swept the crowd with a cool, assessing glance. "I reminded him to stay alert, just in case someone tried anything." He shrugged as if it were nothing more than routine advice. Hermione's eyes narrowed. "Do you really think Harry's in danger?" Ron, clutching a half-eaten chicken leg, joined her in leaning closer to Sherlock. "It was a close call," Sherlock admitted. Then, his eyes brightening, he raised the binoculars again. "Ah, there it is!" Hermione and Ron exchanged anxious looks. The idea that someone might target Harry had drained the flavor from Ron's chicken leg and filled Hermione's stomach with butterflies. Sherlock tucked the binoculars under his arm and looked back at them with a half-smile. "Want to help me keep an eye on things?" he asked. "Absolutely," Hermione and Ron said in unison. "All right, look over there." Sherlock pointed toward a cluster of spectators at the far end of the stands. Hermione lifted the binoculars to her eyes, and Ron leaned in beside her. Together, they scanned the crowd, determined to spot any sign of trouble before it could reach the pitch. Sherlock's voice was barely above a whisper. "Professor Snape?" From her vantage point on the high bleachers, Snape gave a slight nod and murmured back, "A little further to the right." Sherlock shifted his gaze until he spotted Professor Quirrell lingering near the Slytherin goalposts, muttering under his breath. "That far?" Sherlock asked. "Yes," Snape replied coolly. "Your instructions are simple." Sherlock turned to Hermione, his tone urgent. "Stay close and watch him carefully. When I give the signal, you'll need to find a way to interrupt Quirrell's spell. Make sure he never guesses what you're up to." Hermione and Ron's faces grew pale. Ron swallowed hard. "Sherlock, are you saying Quirrell plans to harm Harry during the match?" "If my suspicions are correct," Sherlock said, "today's Quidditch game is the perfect cover for him." Hermione gasped, her hand flying to her mouth. She stole a quick look at Quirrell, then at Harry as he zoomed past on his broom. After a long moment, she squared her shoulders. "Understood. I'll do it." Before Ron could protest, Hermione melted into the crowd, weaving between cheering students. Ron clutched Sherlock's sleeve. "And me? What should I do?" Sherlock gave him a steady look. "Stay here and keep an eye on Quirrell's wand hand. If he tries anything unexpected, I'll signal you." He paused, scanning the busy pitch. "Trust me, Ron. We need every second of this match to keep Harry safe." With that, Ron nodded shakily and settled in beside Sherlock, both of them watching Quirrell's every move as Harry prepared for the next play. "What about me?" Ron asked, frowning. "You'll keep an eye on Professor Snape," Sherlock replied calmly. Ron blinked in surprise. "But you said he's a good person." Sherlock's lips curved in a half-smile. "He is, but somewhat ruthless at times. I need to verify a theory, so I want you to watch him closely from here. No need to join the others." "Got it," Ron said, visibly relieved. He was perfectly happy to follow orders while Sherlock did the thinking. A few moments later, Hagrid arrived, ducking awkwardly under the stadium entrance. Even with Hermione gone, Ron and Neville had to squeeze together to make room for the half-giant. Hagrid glanced around, eyes gleaming. "I was in my hut earlier, but there's nothing like seeing a match live. Now, where's that Muggle girl?" "I sent her off on an errand," Sherlock answered, without diverting his attention from the pitch. Hagrid grunted in approval and settled in to watch. At that very moment, the game shifted dramatically. From the first whistle, Gryffindor chaser Angelina Johnson had seized the quaffle. It slipped free under a beater's bludger but returned to Angelina's hands, and with a powerful kick, she scored the opening goal for Gryffindor. A roar went up from the stands as Slytherin answered back with impressive speed, knotting the score at 10-all. Then a voice crackled through the stadium speakers. "B, rimming with excitement. Hold on. Do I see the snitch?" The announcer was Lee Jordan, longtime friend of the Weasley twins, and the very student Sherlock had studied so keenly while waiting for Harry at Platform 9 to Forcers. Back then, Sherlock had pegged him as a senior, highly expressive, outgoing, gifted with words, and today, Lee's rapid-fire commentary, almost like a rhythmic rap, proved that assessment entirely accurate. At Lee's prompt, spectators across all four houses turned skyward. There, darting through the blue, was a tiny golden sphere, its wings beating so fast they shimmered in the sunlight. The golden snitch had appeared. Chapter 60. Snape by Quidditch Regulations. The first seeker to capture the golden snitch instantly scores 150 points and brings the game to an end. Unless a team already leads by more than that margin, catching the snitch decides the victor. So when the tiny, winged ball darted into view, both Harry and the Slytherin seeker shot forward without a moment's hesitation. They rose in a dead heat, but Harry, already touted as the youngest seeker in a century, soon lived up to his reputation. Exploiting his distinctive flying posture and the advantage of a finely tuned broom, he edged ahead by a full body length. Any onlooker with a shred of experience could tell, barring disaster, the snitch was Harry's for the taking. Among the spectators, Professor Snape's lips curled into a barely concealed sneer. From his vantage point several rows back, his dark eyes glittered with unmistakable disdain. To Snape's right, Professor Quirrell, whose gaze had been fixed intently on Harry since the match began, suddenly narrowed his eyes, watching the young Gryffindor closely as the outcome drew near. Hermione, who had been concealed just beyond the stands, stiffened at the sight and instinctively gripped her wand. Could this be the moment to spring into action? Harry was leaning forward on his Nimbus 2000, hand outstretched, when the world jolted. With a thunderous crack, Slytherin's captain, Marcus Flint, shot in from the side and crashed headlong into Harry's broom. The force sent Harry veering wildly off course. Thankfully, Sherlock's warning had left him mentally braced for exactly this kind of foul play. He tightened his grip, righted the Nimbus, and managed to stay aloft, though his heart pounded in his chest. A collective gasp rippled around the stadium, instantly giving way to a chorus of boos. Madame Hooch sounded her whistle shrill and sharp, halting the game. She swooped angrily down to Flint's side. "That was deliberate, Captain Flint," she snapped. Turning to the Gryffindor stands, she lifted her hand. "Gryffindor will have a free shot at the goalposts." Ron sprang to his feet, fists clenched. "About time," he bellowed. Nearby, Dean Thomas banged on the railing. "Foul play! Send him off, ref! Show him a red card!" Ron frowned at his friend. "You can't send players off in Quidditch, and what's a red card anyway?" Hagrid, who'd been watching from the edge of the pitch, chimed in with a rumble of agreement. "That's right, Ron. Maybe it's high time they rewrote the rule book for a bit more sense." As Madame Hooch reset the quaffle at Gryffindor's free position, the crowd's excitement soared once more. The game was back on, and the chase for the snitch had never felt more personal. Flint nearly sent Harry tumbling from his broomstick, Sherlock observed coolly, his gaze fixed on the tall beater. "He'll pay for that." The surrounding air seemed to chill. Ron, Hagrid, Dean, and the rest all felt a sudden drop in temperature. Just then, Angelina Johnson rocketed the quaffle through the hoops for a free goal, pushing the score to 20-10 and restoring Gryffindor's lead. The ref signaled the match back underway, but the golden snitch had vanished from sight, and a ripple of frustration swept the players and spectators. Harry, however, couldn't help but exhale in relief. Ever since Sherlock's warning, he'd been tense, convinced that Quirrell must have ordered Flint's savage collision. Now it was clear. This had been Flint's own reckless foul, unsportsmanlike and dishonorable. Harry even caught himself wondering, absurdly, if Flint's ruthless style hinted at some distant Korean heritage. Floating high above the pitch, Harry let the thought drift away and found a new one taking its place. Could Sherlock have been mistaken? Harry choked back a thought. Even if Professor Quirrell truly meant to harm me, he'd never be so reckless as to do it in plain sight of every teacher and student. And yet, within the space of a heartbeat, Harry's Nimbus 2000 began to shudder violently beneath him. "Bloody hell!" he swore, dumping any hope that this was just a glitch. Instinct took over. He wrapped his hands around the handle as tightly as he could and wedged the broom between his knees. Almost at once, he realized how right he'd been to brace himself. The nimble old broom that once moved like an extension of his arm was now careening madly through the sky, lurching from side to side in a desperate attempt to fling its rider off into midair. From the stands, Sherlock Holmes was the first to register Harry's distress. He lowered his telescope from the pitch to Professor Quirrell, and there, through the lens, he saw the pale defense teacher staring directly at Harry, yet speaking no incantation, no flick of his wand. Sherlock's pulse raced, a silent spell. He swung his telescope toward Severus Snape, searching for any sign that the potions master might be colluding in this deadly prank. Professor Snape, unlike Quirrell, wasn't staring at Harry, so he probably hadn't spotted anything unusual yet. His gaze was fixed instead on the Quidditch pitch, where a Slytherin chaser had just sent the quaffle through Gryffindor's hoops, tying the score. That play drew most of the stadium's attention, even Snape's. But if there was anyone capable of spotting trouble in an instant, it was Professor Snape. Before a minute had passed, he'd already singled out the real problem and was moving to correct it. Meanwhile, Harry's Nimbus 2000 began to shudder violently, twisting and diving as if alive, carrying him farther and farther above the stands. Only a handful of people noticed the broom's wild behavior. Among them, Ron, who'd been tipped off by Sherlock. "Sherlock!" Ron whispered, panic flaring in his voice. Hagrid, none the wiser to the danger, scratched his head and murmured, "I don't know what Harry's up to. If I didn't know him so well, I'd swear he'd lost control of his broom." "You're right," Sherlock said, voice low and urgent. He handed his telescope, still trained on the action, to Ron. "Keep a close eye on him." Ron seized the telescope and swung it toward the opposite stands. Sure enough, there stood Professor Snape, right in the center, eyes locked on Harry. His lips moved in a rapid, silent chant. What was he doing? "Causing trouble?" Sherlock Holmes called out, his voice calm but urgent. "On the contrary, he's protecting Potter." With that, Sherlock swept his wand in a quick arc. A flare of violet light burst from its tip, racing toward Harry's errant broomstick. In that instant, the truth became clear. Harry was under attack. Even the most unsuspecting spectators sensed the shift. Lee Jordan's excited voice crackled over the loudspeaker. "What's wrong with Potter? His broom's gone haywire. He can't control it." Madam Hooch hovered, wand at the ready, torn between stopping the match and letting play continue. She didn't need to decide for long. Seizing the opening, Marcus Flint snatched the quaffle from a distracted chaser and sailed through the hoops, 3 goals in as many seconds. The Slytherin stands erupted in cheers, but Gryffindor's players were all eyes on their absent seeker. Below Harry's broom, a cluster of students lunged forward, wands raised, determined to guide him down safely. But the moment they came within reach, Harry's broom shot skyward again, leaving them scrambling across the pitch. High in the stands, Hermione Granger sat stiffly beside Professor Quirrell, her heart hammering. She, like Sherlock, had recognized the pattern. Quirrell was weaving a silent curse. All they could do now was watch, and hope they weren't too late to save Harry from whatever dark magic was driving his broom out of control. Remembering Sherlock's instructions, Hermione forced herself to stay still. Her heart hammered as her eyes darted from Harry's tense stance to Quirrell's sneering grin, and then down to Sherlock's shadowy figure beneath the banner. More than once she fought the urge to leap forward, but each time she bit her lip and trusted in his plan. She folded her hands tightly in her lap, lips moving in a silent prayer for Harry's safety. At last, a flare of purple light shot into the night sky from underneath the banner. Hermione's breath caught Sherlock's signal. Without hesitation, she drew her wand and whispered the incantation she had been silently rehearsing. Bright blue flames erupted from its tip, racing straight toward the hem of Quirrell's robe.